Non-human intelligence is real. It has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is ongoing. And all our defense and intelligence and industrial system has been aware of that for a long time.
Matthew Pines, a national security expert, reveals what the government knows about UFOs just weeks before the November 13th congressional hearings.
And we have recovered vehicles, craft, and then we're working to figure out how they work. Harold Malmgren, one of the more well-respected national security folks, and he's just come out and just said it hard in the paint. This is real. We've been figuring this stuff out. People have been injured, threatened, and murdered to protect this secret. And by the way, the president and the vice president and the relevant committees in Congress are just as in the dark as you are.
So while the world focuses on these UFO revelations, Pines and myself expose another urgent threat. Senior officials in Europe are telling their friends capital controls and financial repression are coming. From imminent UFO disclosure to financial collapse, this discussion reveals what insiders know but aren't telling the public. Mr. Pines, we're in an environment of increased uncertainty.
You could say that.
Yeah. It is pretty crazy. We're back. I have you back on the show because of a paper that I was cited in and commented on, which was the European Central Bank's paper about Bitcoin and why people who don't have Bitcoin should avoid it and try to make it illegal. Obviously, the Minneapolis Fed, maybe not obviously, but the Minneapolis Fed came out with a paper not too long after, singing a similar tune, a bit different, but saying that Bitcoin is a risk to our ability to debase the currency and go into as much debt as possible. Maybe we should cut off the exit ramps for individuals and corral Bitcoin into the government so that we can continue to issue debt. But particularly to the ECB, you quote tweeted something I said and said, the European geoeconomic model has failed and the technocrats responsible cannot accept responsibility. What they can do is preempt Bitcoin's response to this failure. Note well, senior officials in Europe are telling their friends capital controls and financial repression are coming. So are you saying these central bankers are afraid of Bitcoin, or they're afraid of the monster that they created themselves, combination of the two?
I think the ECB is. I think in the US, it's probably a bit more nuanced and evolving in terms of there are clearly divergence of various opinions. Institutionally, I think the US system is a bit more differentiated. We can get into that. I think the ECB, though, represents the interests of Europe from a certain perspective, right, which has been pushing a much more federalized vision of the European political system, which is premised on kind of a common economic, integrated market and a currency union. And so the nature of the currency has been a critical pillar of supporting this sort of geopolitical vision, right? Trying to integrate the continent, recognizing that it has very fractious and divergent local cultures, historical enmities, et cetera. So they're much more politically sensitive to anything that could threaten the integrity of the euro as a political project, right? It's much more a political form of money. It's relatively recent, in history. And it's fragile in the sense that it doesn't really span an integrated, say, military system or a geopolitical bloc that can stand as President Macron was sort of pushing before the Russia invasion of Ukraine as sort of a strategic autonomous system that can sort of calibrate on its own terms against increasing, what is a bipolar system, the US and China. So Bitcoin in this sense represents, among other things that have, taken a whack at that vision of kind of European consolidation and strategic autonomy. And so the ECB, which is an institution created essentially to, maintain and bolster that political project, I think is likely to look askance and is looking askance at anything that could threaten it. And they, now are looking out at a geoeconomic environment, which is not very conducive to that project. And, you can go back and replay various decisions that may or may not have been made. I think maybe it was just doomed from the beginning. It's just a matter of how they want to accommodate themselves to the next few years. But they're, German industry is effectively now, handicapped. They're saddled with enormous amounts of debts. They are really stuck between a rock and a hard place in terms of calibrating themselves against U.S. Military and strategic objectives on the European continent, because they don't really have an independent, true military deterrent that can stand on its own 2 feet. And so kind of, I'd say strategically, in a difficult spot. And then the few pillars of their industry are kind of being eaten alive by China, right? So in terms of their automotive industry, their energy sector, it's just not a great place to be if your vision is essentially try to create a monetary bloc that can reinforce the geopolitical vision they have for the European Union. And I think it's like the high watermark of a certain idea that you can sort of tune certain dials from an administrative bureaucracy in Brussels, and then by picking the right inflation targets, by cleverly designing different financial regulations and sort of soft capital controls and financial repression on the margin, that you can kind of keep the system aligned to that objective. And that works okay in a relatively stable external environment, but Europe is not in a stable external environment for all sorts of different reasons. And so now they're kind of stuck. But I think Bitcoin isn't the primary threat immediately to the euro in any direct fashion, but it does, I think, throw into sharp relief the conundrum that faces those administrative technocrats, which is that the system that they preside over is effectively bankrupt, and they're really have no major sources of like get out of jail free cards, right? They've got no breakthrough AI technology. Their AI, their energy infrastructure is basically now hedged to U.S. liquid natural gas. They have these much more fractious internal political disputes and divergences across the continent, and it's just not great for them, right? And so I think my last part of that post was like the whispers going out, right, to the elite who always get the heads up before big changes happen, is that they're going to eventually, maybe sooner rather than later, have to do something a little bit more dramatic, try to keep the project stabilized, and that will likely go in a direction that has usually gone in many similar cases of financial repression and capital controls, right? Is that the whole point is to try to keep people in, right? And the game of being a good technocrat is to try to engineer those capital controls and that financial repression in such a way that doesn't obviously appear to be that's what it is, right? And so there's different, maybe more technocratic ways to kind of do that on the margin through the banking system, through more obscure kind of technical mechanisms, but those only get you so far. And if you do hit a major speed bump, like another major shock, then those sorts of halfway measures aren't going to be sufficient. And so I think there's been discussions, right? You saw the Draghi sort of paper, right? The sort of he's like the king technocrat for Europe, and he was sort of told like go off into the research cellar with a few of your trusted lieutenants and come up with like a master plan for Europe to like fix Europe. And he came out with this long document, and he basically said, right, like Europe is hosed unless we make some like major strategic changes. And it basically is sort of going down this route of increasing sort of consolidation of kind of the federal common debt sort of issuance, choosing sort of strategic sectors to invest in and letting others effectively die, like really prioritizing across the continent where they have a marginal competitive advantage. So it's quite ambitious. It's kind of like the best shot they've got. And so yeah, it's coming down from the top. That basically the writing's on the wall that the way that Europe has sort of structured their geoeconomic position was premised on a whole bunch of things. Relatively stable external global trade, being able to calibrate between U.S. and China in particular, while also preserving kind of this friendly relationship with their main energy source, in Russia, and turn themselves right into, with high education, relatively large population, good geographic position, in principle, they could make that work, right? But all these things sort of went the wrong way for them, right? China, instead of being like a trade partner for them, is like actively trying to undermine most of their strategic industries. They no longer have access to the cheap energy coming out of Russia. Their internal, political fractures have started to like manifest as a result. And yeah, I don't know. It's not great for them. So yeah, Bitcoin is just to them like another problem, right? That is just like another sort of external judgment on their potential strategic difficulties. So it's no surprise to me that they would not be all that positively disposed to it. And yeah, so that's Europe.
Yeah, I mean, you said it seems like the writing is on the wall, but many would argue the writing was on the wall from the onset of the euro. I mean, that's what many major economists were warning about when the euro first launched, I believe in the 90s, correct?
Yeah, there was a bunch of phased implementations as part of the broader integration, but yeah, the 90s were kind of the crucial.
Yeah, and people were warning to say, I mean, people that could look forward and see that the European Union consolidating into this economic agreement with currency and free labor able to move between border somewhat freely, but it seems good and all, but you have different governments and different economies with different policies, and to try to coordinate all of that into a consolidated front that acts in lockstep was warned at the onset of the euro. It's unlikely it's going to happen, and it seems like we're at the end state of what people were warning about in the early 90s, which is it's just impossible to coordinate when you have countries like Germany subsidizing countries like Greece and Italy. It's just not going to work out in the long run.
I mean, that's the thing. It's like for some definitions of long run, right? I think there was a hope that if they were able to kind of keep kicking any sort of major forced crisis or forced choice far enough down the road, that like eventually, almost by like acculturation and like generational turnover, that like it would sort of culturally reestablish a different set of assumptions in different populations as to like the inherent legitimacy of the sort of superstate institutions versus the national institutions. And it was essentially as like a project of almost like state construction, that like this thing called the European Commission and these sort of, supranational institutions like the ECB, have an inherent, issue with legitimacy given just how new they are, right? Like the Fed has been around for a while, and it's still, people like think the Fed is like an illegitimate institution, but like it's basically accepted, right? It's like it ain't going anywhere, right? Like it's just an embedded piece of our institutional system. But like back in the 20s and 30s, like it probably wasn't, it was a much more up in the air thing. If you look at like old debates in the House of Representatives, like, do we really still need a Federal Reserve? Like, what was the original purpose of it, right? So at a certain point, like, you could imagine that just like time eventually,
the Lindy effect kicked in.
Yeah, sort of things eventually that start off fragile and sort of have relatively more loose anchors of legitimacy, right? Just by virtue of surviving long enough, that kind of like the accretion of sort of expectations starts to come into place. And that's kind of how most state systems evolve, right? Like even the US state system, right? It starts out like a thin layer of a federal system over very, very strong state institutions. And through, civil wars and external events and time, like the federal structures eventually accrete more and more legitimacy, more and more power. And then, you get this evolution over time. I think that was a vision behind some of these original bureaucratic moves, was that this will be the trajectory, right? I think, that was optimistic. I mean, we'll still, the European Union is not dead by any means. And you could imagine scenarios where certain crises allow, like give a bit of momentum behind sort of that push towards centralized power. So we'll see. I wouldn't necessarily call it like dead, but I would say like the original ambitions are clearly now sputtering, right? And now they have to sort of salvage like a second best attempt, right, to keep their economies competitive in a global environment where essentially US and China are just carving up everything, and then they're exposed to increased geopolitical risk and spillover risk from instability in the Middle East as well. So they got a lot of problems to manage. That's not like they're in a position to like project global strength, right? They originally had this vision the European Union would eventually consolidate this large economic bloc, really have powerhouse geoeconomic influence that they could then, stand toe to toe, in a global environment with US and China as kind of the dominant poles. And I think that's just an illusion at this point. There's even serious people coming up with plans that involve are essentially like forcing the European Union, the European members to like hand over their gold to the U.S. in exchange for terming out, their debt holdings of U.S. securities, as a way of essentially us, extracting more and more from what you call like the imperial periphery to sort of reinforce the strength of the core, right? And that in this global environment, you could look, simplify in the sense that, there's a massive great power competition, if not conflict, playing out between kind of Eurasian autocratic powers, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. And they're kind of, they're not necessarily like in a military alliance, but they're starting to directly support each other militarily, whether it's North Koreans sending troops and shells, China and Iran with drones and stuff, and kind of just like this reinforcing block around the Eurasian periphery to kind of push against the legacy kind of what you call like G7 system, and sort of G7 / like NATO system. We're facing our own strategic challenges, right? Our own massive debt loads, our own domestic political issues, our own unsustainable fiscal trajectory. And if we ever hit a true problem, and we could be heading towards that soon, we're going to look around to see who we can essentially make eat that pain, right? And the political differential is that if you can make foreign populations and foreign governments eat that pain, instead of your own domestic citizens, well, that's what's going to happen, right? And so, that's what, if I was Europe, that's what I'd be worried about, right? Is that the U.S. can, whereas the Europeans can financially oppress their citizens, the U.S. can financially oppress all of Europe, right? And that's likely what's going to happen. I have no, this is just an analytic forecast, right? This is just the direction, the global system is hierarchical. And that's what I would be girding against if I was Europe. But they've got, it's not necessarily a unified system. They all have their own narrow interests to manage.
Yeah, let's dive deeper into this. Earlier you said the United States is, our economic situation is somewhat differentiated. So diving into that side of it, how are we differentiated, and just building on that line of thought, if there is the prospect of economic turmoil on the horizon and we're looking to externalize the cost of that turmoil onto foreign lands, how does our differentiated stance enable that?
Well, the U.S. is still has lots of strong endogenous sources of national power, right? We're a continent, for one, so we've got two oceans. We have this legacy dominance of international trade through the U.S. Navy, which is heading into some issues. But, in terms of it's like stock versus flow, right? The stock of American power is extremely high, even though you could say that it's at least not growing, right? Maybe it's declining, but the total stock is just very high, right? We've just built up a huge stock of power over the past 100 years, right? Winning multiple world wars, sort of constructing a global trade and financial system that just kept sort of, recycling benefits to the U.S. global position. And so hard power, we still have a lot of strong, hard military power. Obviously, we're starting to stretch and strain that hard power. It's being, put to the test in different conflict zones around the world. But we've got a lot of endogenous hard military power to kind of, more than what, say the Europeans have. And then in terms of strategic technology domains that we're aggressively, as modern economies trying to compete for, whether it's AI, whether it's sort of new energy systems, whether it's space, whether it's life sciences, synthetic biology, these are places where we do have kind of this engine of innovation that most other countries don't have, except for maybe China. And so there are really only a handful of countries that can truly get to and compete at that technological frontier. And where there may be, asymmetric takeoffs in terms of economic, productive advantage remains to be seen, right? Like the AI hype could fizzle out, but there's you're at the roulette table, like we've got more chips to put on different squares that could pay off, right? And even if the stack is getting lower, right, we've got more chips than anybody else at the table, so maybe we get a payoff, right? So I never want to count us out, but it just does mean if you look at your stack and it's going down and you haven't hit one of those payoffs, you're getting an increasingly, say, like more vulnerable position, right? It's not necessarily like, okay, like you could just sit back and relax. And so that's where I think obviously US and versus Europe, we've got like just many different axes of strategic advantage. And in particular, this is like the old story of, like it truly is like a benign, you call it benign, but it is a global imperial system that we've essentially constructed that isn't like traditionally managed the way like old, say the Roman Empire was managed, foreign legions just de facto conquering and enslaving populations and exporting all their wealth back to the core, or like the traditional kind of seafaring colonial empires that would raid, new territories, kidnap slaves, extract all their hard resources and bring it back to, the financial center of the empire. But effectively, that's kind of like the inherent logic of any imperial system. And you can see like we have a version of that that's been constructed over the 20th century. And started off, I would say, a lot more like in the traditional mode of like, yeah, like we're going to carve up the world and we're going to compete against, essentially a Soviet imperial system wants to do their own version of that, but with a slightly different ideological bent to it. But the basic same mechanism, just like establish more control over more parts of the world, subject local populations to essentially repression, financial repression, cultural repression, extract their resources to benefit, your domestic and elite populations. It's just like this is the way these systems go. But they tend to like expand and then sort of reach a point of zenith, and then the size itself becomes a problem, right? There's lots of stories about this in the rise and fall of the Roman Empire and those sorts of things. Are just inherently it's more difficult to manage these large scale institutional bureaucracies that you have to build in order to manage a global empire. And at the start of building this sort of imperial system in the 40s and 50s and 60s, there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of like, technical competence and like folks, Alan, like the Dulles brothers and Vannevar Bush and these guys that were like building these new globe spanning institutional systems. It's like, there's a lot of like energy and momentum behind it. And they're kind of, when you're in that growth mode, everyone's happy, everyone can kind of ride that wave. But then you get to a point of, I'd say, 70s to 90s where it was kind of like, okay, these are mature systems now, and we're trying to manage it, right? And accommodate other changes in the global environment, the rise of China, the fall of the Soviet Union. And it was like, okay, now we can kind of like, we're sort of coasting, right? In that era. Nothing's really getting better, nothing's really collapsing, but we're kind of, this is good. Like we're on the top. In the last 25 years, I think it's been increasingly apparent that like, okay, like we can't really keep this whole structure in place anymore, right? And we're trying to like, prevent a total collapse, and we're trying to fight sort of rearguard actions to shore up different parts of that system as our principal competitors are getting stronger and more aggressive in trying to push it back, and maybe even find ways where they can pull out, supporting infrastructure for it. That's where we are right now, where it's like, okay, we have this sort of like long momentum behind us, but we're kind of in this state of sort of decay, institutional decay, and we're trying to figure out, okay, we have to prioritize. We don't have as much, surpluses, whether it's human capital surpluses or financial surpluses by any means, to kind of keep the system going. So we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we prioritize? And like one key example of this, and just say the military domain, is like, we kind of are at this point where we have to kind of pick and choose how much resources we can push into Eastern Europe, supporting Russia, how much resources we push into the Middle East, supporting Israel, how much resources do we need to push in to bolster the deterrence against China and Taiwan, but also with the Philippines, but also with Japan, with Australia. Like we're realizing we don't have like the military, industrial, and fiscal capacity to like walk and chew gum in all those different theaters to try to keep this global system stabilized in the face of increasing challenge. So that's where I think we're trying to figure out how to do this, and it's clearly putting us into a bit of a quandary.
Sup, freaks? This rip of TFTC was brought to you by our good friends at Bitkey. Bitkey makes Bitcoin easy to use and hard to lose. It is a hardware wallet that natively embeds into a 2 or 3 multi-sig. You have one key on the hardware wallet, one key on your mobile device, and Block stores a key in the cloud for you. This is an incredible hardware device for your friends and family, or maybe yourself, who have Bitcoin on exchanges and have for a long time, but haven't taken the step to self-custody because they're worried about the complications of setting up a private public key pair, securing that seed phrase, setting up a PIN, setting up a passphrase. Again, Bitkey makes it easy to use, hard to lose. It's the easiest 0 to 1 step, your first step to self-custody. If you have friends and family on the exchanges who haven't moved it off, tell them to pick up a Bitkey. Go to bitkey.world, use the key TFTC20 at checkout for 20% off your order. That's bitkey.world, code TFTC20. This rip is also brought to you by our good friends at Coinkite. Coinkite builds the best Bitcoin hardware in the world. There is no second best when it comes to Bitcoin hardware. If you're looking to secure and self-custody your Bitcoin, you can get the MK4 or the Cold Card Q. Cold Card Q has a full keyboard, a QR scanner, NFC enabled, has a battery pack. Put some AA batteries in there, create private public keys off pair in an air gap fashion. Private keys never have to touch an online device. They have their SATS card, which is the best way to give Bitcoin. If you're looking to gift Bitcoin for a wedding, a birthday party, a communion, a bar mitzvah, whatever it may be, tap the card on the back of your phone. You get an address to send to. You send it to that address. It lives on the SATS card. Again, there is no second best when it comes to Bitcoin hardware. The Bitcoin price seems to be going up. You want to take care of your security before Bitcoin goes to 6 figures. Make sure you get your Bitcoin off exchanges using Coinkite hardware, MK4, Cold Card Q. Go to coinkite.com. Use the code TFTC. We have a code now, TFTC, for 5% off at checkout. With all that context, I mean, I think it's making the election more clear to me right now, because just to back up, like, and appease this thought experiment I'm playing down right now. Like, it seems like we're in this transitionary period where the snake is sort of shedding its skin and scraping off the dead skin, that sort of edifice that's been built up over the last century. And maybe internally the federal government recognizes, like, all right, we need to shed this dead skin and really reinvigorate the economy, become competitive in all these areas that you just mentioned. And now it's making, like, it's the last 6 or 3 months, it's been like, how could you seriously put Kamala Harris up as a presidential candidate? And with everything you just said, now it's like maybe internally they recognize the need a sly roundabout way to shed the skin and enable industry to build back in a more organic way. And when you factor in the elite theory that's playing out at the federal level right now, leading up to this election, you have Kamala Harris, incumbent representative of the system that is filled with the dead skin that needs shedding, and then you have Donald Trump, backed by Peter Thiel, Elon Musk. He's got J.D. Vance as his vice president pick. The sort of small tech backing, which is funding things like Anduril, the AI movement, small modular reactor movement. And it's almost like this is the sly roundabout way to shed the skin and allow us to rebuild these critically important sectors via a mandate. If we have like if Trump wins the popular vote and becomes very clear that it seems that the American people want to go in this direction as opposed to staying on the course that we have been on.
Yeah, it's hard to say like how much of this is like a master plan versus just, you like reading a pattern into the inherent chaos of American politics. But I do think there is a certain political economy here that you're pointing out, which is, I think the traditional Democratic coalition, or at least the modern Democratic coalition, is sort of a coalition. I would describe it as a sort of technocratic managerialism, right? And they have sort of a de facto trust in the existing sets of institutions, especially government institutions, where, it's kind of it's sort of, what was the basic political model and meritocratic model of like, you go to school, you get education, you get a PhD, you work in the government, you work in a certain highly regulated industry, you develop a certain expertise in a very narrow domain. you get to a position of relative responsibility within a pretty complicated hierarchical bureaucracy, and you have sort of a little bit of power, right? You write that policy reg over that industry, or you are in that industry and you help, write the regs for yourself, or you're an academic, or you're a civil servant. And in general, right, those sorts of sort of social roles have, accreted more and more power over the last, say, 50 years as we've sort of grown these bureaucratic structures, and they've, these only kind of go one way, right? And the lesson of just any human institution is like, there's inevitably there's sort of rot that seeps in to any system over time, right? The sort of rules only get more complicated, right? More, inefficiency kind of gets built up over time. And then you get to this point of like, any system needs structural reform, right? When you get to that point. And then you get this sort of political fight over, does the reform come from within, right? Does it come from within that class of sort of managerial technocrats that look at their own institutions, with a hard eye, or they're facing an external crisis, say a war, economic crisis, or what have you, and there's like enough momentum that gives, enlightened new leadership in that institution to like reform it, right? Fix it from within. And versus these external pressures where it's like the sort of, we're just going to burn it down, right? We're going to clear out the dead wood, and we're going to start with a clean slate. And I think that's where we're facing right now, is like this certain set of folks that look at these institutions and they realize they've kind of reached a sort of internal pathology, decay, and they just want to break them right from the outside and start fresh. And I think some of that is also being, so like I sort of see this from, I try to be like an analyst at heart. I'm like, I kind of see both perspectives, right? I see the perspective of someone who says they're unsalvageable, they need to be replaced. Well, also I see the perspective of someone who's like, there's a lot of like, these systems, like it's like baby with bathwater sorts of stuff, right? Like these systems, they function. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm envisioning the software meme now where it's like you have like all the blocks stuck up, and then there's like the one block. It's like only if people knew that like this little piece at the bottom is holding everything up. And
yeah, it's like I'm more of like a traditional conservative in that sense of pragmatism, which is like, think about second and third order effects of any action, and understand that you inherently can't predict what's going to happen. These are complex, systems, and like, defer in general to like, lessons of history, which is like, if a thing is being done a certain way for a certain reason, it's probably a good reason, right? Why, right? Like it might not be like just the most prudent action, be like, we're just going to, just erase that piece of code, right? Because the programmer left, 20 years ago, and you're like, oh, well, this probably don't need this anymore. And you just delete it and you go, oh crap, like the whole system goes down, right? And so you can have these systems where like, you can look at the code and you're like, this is really rotten code. It's really complicated. Probably half of this code doesn't really do anything, right? I really need to get in here and like do a clean rewrite, right? It would be easier just to like delete it all and start with some fresh software. That's often easier said than done, right? Because usually the code that you're looking at is doing something really important for you, right? In fact, if you look at, I do the cyber stuff, right? There's many businesses like this where you talk to senior engineers at some of the big tech companies, people that, help keep modern civilization alive, and they'll tell you, right? Like, yeah, like we're in a Frankenstein sort of IT stack, right? We've got some really cool new hot stuff, and then we've got this other stuff that's been here for 20 years, and we're just sort of duct taping it together. And yeah, they'd be like, we really definitely want to, like, if we could, we would really get rid of that, but it's holding up like critical things, and there's just no way, like no easy way, and maybe no low risk way to do that swap, and so you're kind of stuck. And that's, I think, where we are at in sort of our political economy is like, we're, and it's like, okay, how do you do that like in the right way? And I don't have the right answer there, but I think that's what we're facing is these, the pressure is just to get in there and just delete it all, right? And of course you have like the sort of Elon side of things. It's like, oh, I just go into Twitter, I delete, 75% of those engineers, and Twitter still runs, right? Oh, that's proof that you could do that, right? And maybe, but it's like that's an N of one, right? And it was also Elon. It was also like, kind of one relatively simple social media company, right? I don't know if that's like a template for reform in any arbitrary institution, right? And so I know I try to like keep myself grounded in like a pragmatic approach to institutional reform. But I think you're right. Like we're not really in a great spot where, these are the two candidates that we have to pick from, right? In my opinion, right? Like, it's more of a symptom of where we are as a democracy that like these are the two options we've got. Right. And I think everyone would basically be like, we would much rather have like a fresh set of people with like energy and like clear competence and a vision and like clear leadership skills and demonstrated executive presence, and we just don't have those on the option. And yeah, so I'm a little bit disappointed in our society, but that's where we are.
Is the coalition that's building behind Trump not appealing to you at all? That's the one thing.
Yeah,
it seems like I mean, people have been marketing as like the Avengers. You get Trump, Vance, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, Vivek Ramaswamy, many others. Externally, Tucker Carlson, Elon Musk, obviously, a lot of Silicon Valley, and it does give like it's the first time in a while where it's funny because we had this on Rabbit Hole Recap where I made the mistake of saying it seems like the most important election of our lives and got gotcha'd because that is what is said at every election. And I've never believed it up until this point where it's like, it really does feel like we are at a critical crossing point and need to make a decision one way or the other to try and salvage and fix things. And I know maybe I'm naive getting duped by the propaganda, but it does seem like when you see Elon landing that ship, when you see everything going on with Anduril, and you look at the military budget, and you look at how much it costs them to spin up their defense tech, you look at Starlink, many other things, again, SMRs becoming more of a trend, and Trump promising that he's going to let that industry flourish. Like that seems much more preferable, tangible, and more importantly, it seems tangible because we're getting examples of it every day with product launches from the private market.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always resistant to joining a team. Maybe it's just like psychologically, I like feel like I'm being tricked by somebody when they tell me to join their team. Because I feel like as soon as you decide I'm going to sign up for a team, human psychology is like, wraps itself in such a way that you tend to justify all the actions of that team. And then you force yourself to make different compromises along that way. But I think, directionally, I certainly am inspired by the achievements of some of those folks like Elon. I think you just have to objectively look at what the SpaceX crew has done and be like, this is how you, potentially along other directions, like reinvigorate American society, reinvigorate American power, and kind of try to, jumpstart a new vision for, what the A16Zs call American Renaissance. But I also think, I don't know, because it's being driven by so many really rich people and like people that are experts in propaganda, I'm like, I don't know, like I am mentally preparing to be like, God damn it, Marty, you got your hopes up again. I mean, it's just like the system's like really like there's one thing American system is really good at is like tricking people, right? Like at scale. Really just, whether it's just in terms of political propaganda, consumerism, just like we live in a mirage, right? And, the media algorithm, just is really good at pumping people into different tribal camps and activating that sort of limbic energy and just like directing them at each other and just these collisions of like social, emotional, psychological stress that just feeds the algorithm more, gets the eyeballs, gets the advertising. It's just designed to kind of turn you into this cog in this machine. And I don't know, I try not to become sucked into that, but like just analytically I think the US is in a position, I think to your point, like why is this the most important election? I think it's like stock market reaching all-time highs sort of thing. It's like in any exponential process, right? You can have like the decay or instability or dynamic decision energy at stake in any given election is like going along this exponential curve, right? And so like the background environment on which we're making these political decisions is changing on an exponential pace. And so kind of almost by definition then, like any election that potentially steers that exponential trajectory in a certain way is going to have like an outsized effect relative to the previous election. That's going to be almost true just by the nature of the processes that are unfolding. And so the next election will be the most important election. And then the election after that will be the most important election. Like there'll just be this constant sense that like every decision will have this exponential divergent effect, right? So with like that's just the nature of the ride we're on, right? Right. I don't think we're going to get to this point where it's like, oh, this was the most important election, but then the next one is going to be like just a chill, like, oh, normal thing where it just kind of like flip the coin. It's like, no, they're all going to be, just my default assumption, they're all going to be like the sense of the stakes being bigger than they ever were, because that's just the nature of the technological curve, the geopolitical curve. So like the psychosocial curve we're on is like human beings plugged into these digital systems of emotional manipulation. And yeah, so I don't know, that was a bit of a rambling nonsense answer to dodge that question of like, whose camp am I in?
No, I don't. I wasn't.
Yeah.
I don't think that was a dodge. So I don't think there is a clear answer. I think I would much prefer, even though I'm highly skeptical and can see myself getting my hopes up and getting duped in the future, even so, like I think the other path, they're not painting an optimistic future. Like any policy, there really hasn't been any clear policy put forth, and it seems, I mean, just what we've seen in terms of their posturing towards our industry here in Bitcoin, like that alone.
Yeah, I think that's where
deducing it to a single issue vote. It's like,
yeah, it's not ambiguous there. I agree with you, right? It's pretty clear on the just digital asset front that that one side is much more positively disposed than the other side. But if I'm being like truly kind of like real politic about it, right? Like, I don't know, like there's a sense in which this is a bit more like a hot take-ish, but it's like clearly like don't sort of mid curve it, right? It's like you can imagine a scenario. It's like, oh, actually, Bitcoin would be better if it was tested under a much more hostile administration for another 4 years, prove that it can survive, right? And then it is basically stateless money for the world, and it's just it just gets forged in the fire of another hostile administration, and then boom, it's like invulnerable, right? Versus, okay, take the YOLO play with Trump, where he's like, yeah, I'm gonna buy it at scale. I'm going to put it on the national balance sheet. I'm going to like appoint a bunch of pro-Bitcoin people to senior positions in my administration. We're going to trigger this geopolitical arms race with Saudi Arabia and China and the Emirates, and we're just going to like YOLO into Bitcoin. Like that seems almost too good to be true, right? From like a pure narrow Bitcoin perspective, like I don't know if it's going to work out quite as cleanly as that. And I'm like fundamentally like a risk analyst in the sense like what could go wrong, right, with that scenario? Not to say that it the net expected value could be positive relative to the alternative, but like doesn't mean there aren't like corner cases to be worried about. Like one corner case is that like like for example, Trump I don't think is like ideologically like born and bred a Bitcoiner, right? I think he's a mercurial politician who is just looking for votes, and he's like, these guys seem to like me. They're giving me money, I'll align with them. And he'll appoint positive kind of pro-Bitcoin people, right? And so eventually policy is personnel, so that would be maybe more structurally embedded. But I can imagine like corner scenarios where like the YOLO strategy is like almost too successful in the sense that it creates like you can imagine, for example, just take the strategic Bitcoin reserve idea, right? Like buying 200,000 Bitcoin or keeping the existing 200,000 Bitcoin that we already have, from various seizures, and just putting it on the national balance sheet, more like a signaling thing. Wouldn't really do much, right? Buys 1 million Bitcoin, probably very significant for the price, but would it like lead to like a financial run on the dollar? Probably not. But if the U.S. government came out and said, we're going to buy several million Bitcoin like as soon as practically possible, just the effect, I mean, I don't think that's a realistic thing to do, but it's like it's on the policy option set. If they were to do that, rational people would be like, well, the U.S. government is effectively telling me I shouldn't own any treasury securities. Like they're buying millions of Bitcoin. I'm going to buy millions of Bitcoin and sell all my treasury securities. And if that were to happen, essentially would be the federal government basically precipitating a run on its own debt market. And if you kind of do that, in a rapid fashion, like there could be all sorts of secondary consequences to the banking system, to the mortgage market. There could be like a whole bunch of things that just start breaking. And then in that scenario, I can imagine, the adults in the room going to Trump and be like, this Bitcoin thing that you just sort of, forced us into is now like causing this financial crisis. You gotta do the 180, right? And he goes, oh, I'm not being blamed for this. These Bitcoin bros, they had their chance to make money on the run up, rug pull, right? And then, undoes everything, maybe even sells what he just bought. And, the full thing just comes like crashing down. And that was like your one shot, right? And then never again will another president ever kind of go that direction, right? And so that's where I kind of worry about is like those corner cases of like, if you're gonna, go in this direction, it's like a deliberative, calibrated, well thought through set of policy moves that wouldn't necessarily be like the just go all in all at once. Yeah, but that's because I'm fundamentally more like a risk averse pragmatist. There's probably other people who are like, oh, you're just like, this is why you're not in your private jet, Pines, right? Because you don't know how to like take the positive EV bet, even if it blows up in your face, like the net EV is, you conquer the world, right? So, but that's just my take.
This rip was also brought to you by our good friends at Salt of the Earth. You got to be hydrating, freaks, and while you're hydrating, you got to be getting your electrolytes. This is the best electrolytes mix that I've ever come into contact with. Pink Himalayan salt with calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, no sugar. It tastes incredible. My favorite is the orange and the pink lemonade. Go to drinksote.com. That's drinksote.com. Use the code TFTC when you make your purchase, and you'll get 15% off. I'm telling you, get on it, freaks. You're going to love this stuff. And yeah, you definitely would want this measured response. Like, RFK was arguably more. He was pushing the YOLO, like, we're going to get 4 million Bitcoin as quickly as possible. But I think it would have to be a much more measured approach. Simple things like, all right, capital gains tax is gone. You can spend Bitcoin and use it as a savings account. We're going to let the banks hold Bitcoin. And yeah, we'll put some Bitcoin in the treasury as well, but not set off the arms race with other geopolitical players that see you can accumulate 4 million Bitcoin first.
Yeah, I mean, the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where national security fellow actually now going to be supporting as sort of their head of strategy as they sort of scale up some of their operations.
Congrats.
Yeah. David Zell, Grant McCarty, these guys have, turned that sort of YOLO idea into like a legit think tank now. We have like 20 plus fellows. Going to be 2025 is going to be a big year for BPI. Really, scaling up a lot of the activities. But we just put out a white paper by, he's actually an economist in the intelligence community named Matthew Ferranti. And the title of the paper is The Case for Bitcoin as a Strategic Reserve Asset. And it's like, it's a decent report, and it goes down kind of like the checklist of different features of Bitcoin that, allow it to serve this role as a global reserve asset for central banks, for example. And it's kind of crazy to have like a guy who's a PhD from Harvard. His advisor, I think, was Ken Rogoff, who's like,
NERP, the NERP guy.
Yeah. And so he's comes out of the full institutional framework, right, piped into the intelligence community, and he's just, makes perfect sense to have Bitcoin alongside gold as part of your sovereign reserve portfolio. So it's like, I think people haven't quite understood how much things have shifted in certain circles on this question, where there's some people who are still think that it's like an absurd idea. And there's other people that are just like, yeah, it's perfectly sensible. And these people will like come out of that pipeline, Harvard, Rogoff, intelligence community, PhD, like they're there. And I think this is the trajectory. This is the part where in this weird zone of uncertainty, or, where some people's Overton window has moved pretty wide. Others is still very narrow. And I think that's like creating a lot of interesting dynamics inside DC, where a lot of the traditional tropes about how people approach Bitcoin were kind of just embedded as like, oh, like you sneer at it, you make fun of it, it's not a serious thing. And then you all of a sudden have people that are very serious people be like, oh, this is a serious thing. And that kind of like, for that like managerial technocrat that like prides themselves on like having a domain of expertise and control, that they know the left and right corners of their field and their domains of responsibility, and that they also have control over what comes in and out of that policy space, right? It affronts it offends or affronts them in a way psychologically to have something like Bitcoin kind of come from this cypherpunk, anarcho-capitalist, internet, Bitcoin bro world, and now like intrude on their staid, well-managed, well-curated sort of policy garden. It's like, the kids across the road have come and sort of trample in your gardenias, and the people pruning the hedges are looking up in alarm. That's I think where we are now, right? That's why you get these reactions from the ECB and the sort of regional banks at the Federal Reserve is like they're just offended, right? But I also think it comes out of the was it the Minneapolis Fed or was it the
Minneapolis Fed? Yeah.
Yeah, Minneapolis Fed one. It was interesting because it was like both of those papers were actually like extremely bullish.
Yeah.
Right. It's like I think they were citing you. It was like it's kind of shockingly like more bullish than I would be of like 10 million a coin. Right. It was like, okay, like I that's not my personal target, but like go for it, ECB. And then the Minneapolis Fed, which is like, at a certain point, they're like, oh, like if there actually is this relief valve for people to essentially escape financial repression in the treasury market, then this will be a problem as the government runs up against sort of fiscal constraints. Like we need to essentially corral available pools of capital into instruments that we can sort of leverage to impose financial repression, right? And that is the game here. And I think it's funny, like those people though aren't thinking geopolitically or politically, really, right? They think in terms of how do we regulate domestic pools of capital to financially repress. I think the way it's likely going to happen is we're going to, as all empires do, like brides and circuses for the people, slave and misery for everybody else, right? Like, and that's the benefit / moral maybe perversion of being a citizen of an empire is that usually you don't get to feel the pain, or at least some of your citizens usually feel the pain, but usually at least the upper middle classes get protected because those are the ones that have political influence, just the nature of these systems. And so ironically, like I think the way this will happen, this would be more clear under a Trump administration, TBD how a Harris administration would manage this. I think it'd be a little bit more, I think they would struggle to find this balance between like aggressively making our allies and partners feel the pain versus like making our domestic banks and institutional pools of capital feel the pain. That's basically the game, is like, who's going to feel this pain, right? We've got all this debt overhang. We've got all these implicit obligations to our elders, to our social safety nets, to rearm, our societies, to regreen our societies, massive new investment in domestic manufacturing and infrastructure for all sorts of different reasons, geopolitical and climate and otherwise. Who's going to pay for that, right? Like someone's got to pick, right? We can't just let, quote unquote, the free market, allocate credit. And, if you're sitting in a policy, or if you're sitting in the top of one of these asset managers that are increasingly the source of most credit allocation, or a central bank, or a large bank, and you're told by the powers that be, the next marginal marginal dollar of credit isn't going to go to fanciful fintechs or next whatever self-driving delivery app. It's going to be semiconductors, it's going to be chip fabs, it's going to be AI, sort of SMR sort of facilities. That's who's going to get preferred credit. And the question is, okay, well, domestically, I don't think, like under Trump administration, I think what they would likely do is repress our allies and partners, essentially make them finance these strategic investments as well as defray some of the costs of empire, essentially. Make them pay, right? Make the periphery pay. Create essentially a tech and tariff wall around the world, and essentially tell our allies and partners and other sort of folks straddling the fence, if you want to be, behind that tech and tariff wall, meaning we don't impose 200% tariff on you, and we don't block you from getting access to our advanced AI inference infrastructure, et cetera, as well as maybe other technologies that could be rolling out soon. as well as our defense umbrella, our nuclear umbrella, et cetera. Like if you want to be under that umbrella, that sort of tech tariff nuclear umbrella, then you've got to essentially pay for the ticket to get in. And the ticket to get in is probably going to be like buy century bonds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Term out your debt, to help us term out our debt from bills to 100 years. And that's like a high stakes play. I could see working, I could see blowing it up, because it assumes you kind of have the geopolitical leverage and technical competence, diplomatic competence, to sort of force those hard choices on the Europeans, on the Saudis and the Emiratis, on the Singaporeans, on the Japanese, on the South Koreans, on the Australians, et cetera, who are all facing their own issues, and basically force them to eat that pain. And that might come at a geopolitical consequence, in the sense that it might force that line to move further back towards us than it otherwise would, right? Because I think the best case scenario is like, if you think about like the map of the world, like where this line's going to be drawn, ideally it would be drawn like where the existing, boundaries of American power are, right? And like would never retreat, right? First island chain, Taiwan, Middle East, Eastern Europe. And so the idea is that if you can basically put these tech tariff geopolitical gates around that whole sphere, that sort of dollar sphere, then you get like a new lease on life, right? Because you actually get to do another kind of injection of capital and resources, right? Maybe even force them to swap their gold, force them to swap their short-term treasury bonds. You get to essentially absorb more capital at the core, term out your national debt, then use that to finance these strategic investments and reinforce essentially your top of the pie hierarchy in this global system. That would be like, everything going well.
Threading the needle.
That would be like threading the needle. I think there's a narrow path you could do to execute that. And I think there's certain people that have that on the drawing board, but the adversary gets a vote, and it assumes there are no like other fragilities or crises that could come in the way of that. And it also doesn't assume that that assumes that you can do the master plan across this big geopolitical chessboard and do all those hard trade-offs. As if you look at like how we do diplomacy and our geoeconomic policy formation, it's highly parochial and highly driven by like factional influence in different parts of, say, the State Department or the intelligence community, where like the people that sort of work the Japan issue versus the Taiwanese issue versus the the Israel issue, they're not necessarily are thinking in terms of American grand geoeconomic strategy. They're usually thinking in terms of how can I get a plum job right after I do this year or two policy stint, and I'm some of them are actually compromised foreign agents themselves. There's a lot of incentive to implant agents of influence in these systems because of how much power they have, and you can look at scenarios where that has occurred. So I think a lot of these people drawing up these like master grand strategy plans to like, okay, this is the one weird trick to like save American global hegemony. Sort of, it'd be like, okay, well the details are left for the reader to work out. It's like if only they follow this 10-step plan, we're good. When you actually look at the institutions and the bureaucracies and the people that would have to execute that, and I include both any future Harris or Trump administration, I haven't yet seen, I could be proven wrong, like people that would fill those slots and also have the be able to then wield those instruments of bureaucratic power to then execute this grand strategy, right? It's like the hope is that what's motivating this, and this is also why I kind of had this concern, is that the folks kind of pushing this direction, and they're actually both in the sort of Trump camp and in the Harris camp, although they have a different take on it, is like China is the pacing threat. China is an industrial powerhouse. They're climbing technological value chains. They have an aggressive military modernization, ambitions under Xi to, take some strategic moves. And they're really worried. Like the whole apparatus of American power is like terrified. And so it's manifesting in like different responses. But the response on both the right and the left in many ways is that we need to kind of like emulate China in our preferred way in order to beat China. So on the left is like, we need to emulate their sense of central, like their design of like central planning and sort of credit allocation by technical mandarins that know better how to allocate capital in society. And we need to have, essentially social censorship to make sure that like we don't get, this unity of cohesive force undermined as we're facing a relatively unified adversary. So we need to like suppress dissent, align finance and political capital to then, reinforce, American power. And then along the way, project our sort of liberal vision of human rights, around the world. And the right is a little bit more like hard realpolitik about, well, we want to unleash the private sector, since use the private sector essentially as arms of this geopolitical competition, where essentially the private sector essentially gets to enrich themselves on this sort of great power conflict, like the Anduril's of the world, the Palantirs of the world, like SpaceX's of the world. Like, hey guys, we're the ones that are going to be the key to defense of Taiwan. We're going to be the ones that are the key to strategic leadership in technology, in AI, in space, in drones, etc. So, we need to essentially get those big contracts. We need to get that preferred credit, allocation. You need to give us subsidies for our AI data centers. That's basically just a different version of, in the China system is like these strategic favored industries close to the state system get preferred access to capital. So I look around, I'm like, there's not that much of a different, view. It's just like who's going to pick who, like which winners and which losers. But we've kind of all accepted this idea that we need to essentially adopt more like China style system of centralized control. And it's just a matter of where you're drawing the lines between, say the anointed private sector versus like the preferred, sort of government, sort of technocrat mandarins. It's like the people in the private sector say, oh, Elon and Peter Thiel and Palmer Luckey, and the VC class that funds them, they know better how to fight great power competition. But they don't say, oh, leave us alone, government. They say, no, give us billions of dollars in contracts. Give us cheap credit, right? That's not like the traditional, small government conservative. That's just like, oh, actually, I want the government to support me and I don't want to have to take orders from what I view as this kind of corrupt, indulgent DC class, right? They may be right, but it just happens to also be quite self-serving as an argument. So anyways, that's my like rant on this whole thing. I'm not sure where I was going with that, but there you go.
No, but you mentioned you question whether either administration could place the right people in places of power to thread the needle that you described. Do you have a roster of people in your mind who would be...
It's tough, man. I mean, I would say that there's a characteristic type. And, there's lots of people I think could be good, but I think it's a type of person that you don't see too much, but when you see it, you kind of recognize it. And that, actually, I'm sort of stealing this from a global forecaster named David Marin. Smart guy, super eloquent. I don't necessarily agree with all of his theses. He sort of reminds me of, what's his name? Who's the geopolitical guy that always like says things with like 100% certainty? Everyone was, oh God, I'm blanking on his name. People in the comments will certainly know who I'm talking about. I'm just like having a brain fart. He also like famously hates Bitcoin.
Kyle Bass?
No. He's a pure like geopolitical consultant. Blanking on his name.
Oh, it's Peter Zeihan.
Peter Zeihan. Yeah, God, say Zeihan. Yes. So he's like, I would say he's a more measured, I'd say intelligent version of sort of Zeihan, but he has the same sort of like very definitive conclusions. But anyways, that's an aside to say David Marin has a good diagnosis though of like different psychological types and this alignment to kind of our political order or disorder, as the case may be, between say lateral thinkers and linear thinkers. And that this sort of managerial technocratic system that we've built, in most modern societies has really favored like a type of linear thinker, right? Someone who understands these are the rules, this is how you execute, these are managing systems requires like writing down rules to manage the systems, right? So you're really good at, executing a plan, defining a plan. It's like strategic planning. It's all this sort of linear process of laying out and managing complicated sort of bureaucratic systems. And those people tend to thrive in stable environments, like almost going, if you have almost like sort of hunter-gatherer versus agricultural, right, sort of systems. Like if you're a farmer, it's really, you're rewarded being a linear thinker, right? Because it's okay, this is when I plant, this is when I harvest, this is how I do minor adaptation to any changes, but it's basically a predictable sequence. And you gotta have like a really refined, repeatable process. And when things are stable, that sort of mindset is really good, right? Whereas the lateral thinker is more like hunter-gatherers. They're like, I have to constantly bring in a multivariate, complicated set of trade-offs in a really high, uncertain environment. And I've got to be inherently much more flexible and adaptable and creative and energetic and proactive. I've got to constantly explore new territory to find new food or new opportunities or identify, potential tail risks. And so any system, is always like, providing either incentives or disincentives, favoring one mental type or the other type. I think our system is, overly incentivized a certain linear type, right? I think most of the people that you look at when you're sort of, okay, this person is just a brain dead technocrat. They're just a linear thinker, right? And so like lateral thinkers, right, tend to be a little bit more like higher risk, right? Traditional entrepreneurs, right? Folks that don't necessarily follow a certain cultural mode. And they're inherently more risky, right? This is why these are trade-offs, right? In human sort of institutions, is like lateral thinkers are good at managing existing institutions and following existing rules and reinforcing the current rules, and
linear thinkers are.
Sorry, linear thinkers, and sort of reinforcing the stability that everyone wants, right? Everyone wants stable systems, stable societies, stable economies. No one wants to constantly have to wake up and deal with something new, right? They got other stuff to deal with. Like the job of the government, people managing systems, like so that like the background infrastructure and systems of my life don't like radically change from day to day. It's just like make it work, don't break anything. Like not looking for you to like radically innovate, but like be just minimally competent and effective at your job. And that's fine. Like we need those people, right? I'm not saying there's one inherently better or worse type. It's very like context dependent. But I think it's clear that we've like kind of over indexed on one type. And so if I'm like the type of person we need making these decisions has to be much more like that lateral thinker. You go back to say World War II, and maybe that's like the classic trade-off is like, Chamberlain versus Churchill, right? It's like someone who's like grew up in a relatively stable peacetime environment, understands the rules of diplomacy, certain embedded expectations, and is just completely taken by surprise when events go in a way that was outside of their framework, right? And whereas Churchill was much more adaptive, much more perceiving lateral changes in the environment, and then making high risk gambits along that fashion. I think we need to move in that direction, more lateral thinkers. Sometimes the systems force you in that way, right? Like when you start fighting wars, right? Like field commanders that are linear thinkers tend to like get killed or get rapidly, demoted or kicked out of command positions. Because you're facing an environment where there's, immense almost immediate consequences for bad decision making. And the problem is a lot of these environments, there isn't really that feedback loop between poor policy, right? It could be like a multi-year lag between that NSC staffer who writes that executive order or contributes to that memo or that policy, and then it creates it's a big F up, but it doesn't really become apparent, the strategic costs, till 2-3 years later, if not later. And by that point, the person's gone. They're in a senior position at Council on Foreign Relations. They're on the think tank circuit. They're writing their book. They've checked their status stamp, right, in their career, and there's no skin in the game, basically, right? So I think it's people, but it's also this like institutional expectation that like you go into government to like do a particular job. The expectation is that you're not just going to be a permanent bureaucrat, right? It's like your job, like right now, it's like people think, and I come from some of this world, is like the highest marker of status is like get to become director of National Security Council staff and then write that memo. And then that becomes like your brag sheet when you go to the private sector and you want to go senior consultancy or you're some strategic advisory or private equity job or on a think tank. And it's fine. There's a whole people. It's like, it's a established kind of career trajectory. I get it. Like, that's just our system. But it has this perverse, I'd say, externality, which is that there is not much of a skin in the game between people making policy and the effects of that policy. other than just like, you go to a debate and somebody goes, well, that was a bad idea. And you go, yeah, but I still got a good salary and a good job, and I'll probably never actually like face any professional reputation. Like, look around, like nobody in positions of politics, whether it's Iraq War or anything, it's like no one's ever faced any consequences for that. So anyways, that was again another rambling answer, but like I want to look for like lateral thinkers and folks that are not trying to go into government to like stay in that sort of think tank world. They're like, I'm going to come in, I'm going to do this particular job. I got like a year, 2 years. If I feel like I cannot make the impact that I want to make, I'm out. I'm going back. I'm doing something completely different, right? I think you need to have that norm established and then attract people in there that are motivated to execute on a plan, but are willing to basically adapt and break down any norms that might be implicitly established inside these institutions. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but that's like, I think the only shot you got. And I think it's also it's a real advantage that our system, in theory has over, say, the Chinese system. Like the Chinese system, their advantage is scale and mass and the fact that they've executed this long range plan. They're like really good linear thinkers, right, in a certain way, but they're also wedded to this really competent bureaucratic structure, right? So it's like you have linear thinkers and actual competence because they're mostly technocrats, engineers, and not like lawyers. So they actually had to like figure out how to like build things that work. And then they sort of played us for fools over many decades. A lot of us basically sell off our manufacturing industrial base for parts in order to enrich Wall Street. And they're like, yeah, thank you, sir. We'll keep doing that as long as you're willing to hand that over. But the one inherent limitation of the Chinese system is because they all report up to this one guy. And they're all really terrified of, stepping out of line. It does not incentivize lateral thinkers, really, right? And so if there is an advantage we have to play is that traditionally the American system, usually generates more lateral thinkers, the kind of the inherent, but we try to find this right balance because you can just have total chaos and just like, I'd say the extreme limit of a linear thinker is like a brain dead technocrat, right? But the extreme limit of a lateral thinker is like a pure sociopath, like con artist, right? Who's really good at talking and exploiting and moving around like an ecosystem. And you have to look at a lot of Silicon Valley and you're like, well, there's a lot of those types too. There's a lot of people that just spin castles in the air, convince a bunch of rich people to give them millions of dollars, absolute fraud, vaporware. But there's actually little consequences for those people, even in this environment, right? People just, I was in the arena, I was trying things. My fraudulent company, right, just happened to fail. But, it wasn't my fault. It was just, I was trying a hard thing. I was shooting for the moon, right? I was going after this crazy cool thing. And, I at least put my skin in the game and I was trying it, whereas maybe you were just enriching yourself and your family members and, exploiting, essentially a bunch of rube family offices. So, yeah, I think there's problems on both ends of the spectrum.
You got Adam Nallman, Theranos Woman, Elizabeth Holmes, Sam Bankman-Fried. They fit that archetype. But I think I want to consolidate what you just said there. I think what you're trying to say is like we need to make civil servants again if we're going to fix these problems with these lateral thinkers that get in with the express purpose and goal of fixing a particular problem over a certain period of time and then fuck off and don't try to get into the revolving door of the bureaucracy and just do their job as a civil servant and get out.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, I don't think that's going to change regardless of administration, but I think it's be helpful on the margin to set that expectation. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not like, who am I, right?
Don't sell yourself short. Don't sell yourself short, sir.
Yeah. But I'd be like, I live in DC, right? Or I live outside DC. I live in McLean. So I look around and I'm like, my personal like real estate value is basically contingent on the DC blob never shrinking. Right? So I'm like, yeah, come in and cut all this. Be like, well, I realize like it's kind of a fascinating fact that like the DC area, sort of suburban zip codes are like some of the wealthiest in the country. And I'm like, what does DC do? Like, what do we produce, right? Like, do we have a big financial capital? Do we have a bunch of like tech companies? Like, why is this like the richest zip code in the country almost?
Because the treasury is there.
I mean, that's the problem, right? Is that like these are this is just an embedded feature of our system. I don't think like an election is going to solve this. And I think it's also like setting your expectations. Like, don't hero worship, right? Don't be like, oh, this is the one, messiah figure who will go in there and clean all the rot out, right? I think people that believe that are the people that get played by those people, right? Because they go, oh no, I'm actually going to go to Washington and I'm going to be the one that cleans it up. And then meanwhile, they're just stuffing their pockets with money, right? That's like in history, that's like the tried and true, method. So I'm like, I would need to be proven otherwise. I would love to be proven wrong, but like, that's usually how things go.
Yeah. And if you're not thinking forward, I mean, you should probably be looking at what is actually happening. Actually, the timing of this conversation is pretty incredible considering what we talked about earlier this summer. That conversation was highly focused on this arms race around AI and energy, and we talked a lot about computer chips and how the U.S. is in a systemically weak position globally in terms of the production of these chips. But we had a headline out of Arizona yesterday with TSMC in the factory that they're building there, and it was a shocker to me. And I'm curious to get your opinion on this, or if you have any information closer to the source based off that headline. But the headline was essentially that the TSMC foundry in Arizona is producing chips at the quality that are being produced in Taiwan, and maybe even producing them faster than some of the foundries in Taiwan. What is your read there? Have you read into this at all?
Yeah, I mean, this is like the one benefit of the U.S. system, which is right now we can still spend ungodly sums of money, and we can import highly skilled people from the rest of the world. So that's basically what we did. We're like, we need to have the Chinese chip fab. What do we need to do? We just spend basically tens of billions of dollars very quickly, and we need to import the thousands of actual specialized engineers from Taiwan to do it. There you go, right? So when push comes to shove, we can do that sort of thing. And of course, when you're building a new facility from scratch, there's all sorts of I'm sure lessons learned that the Taiwanese have. Man, to really optimize this process, it would be really great if this building was a little bit closer over here, and maybe this facility would be a little bit more better if it was configured here, because they've been building on top of their own fabs, so I'm trying to expand out. But you're always kind of building on top of yourself and sort of constrained a bit by what you were doing before. So I'm not that surprised they're able to get some efficiencies and gains that they didn't have in their home facilities, because you're just starting from scratch. You're like, all those good ideas, those little marginal improvements, now you can implement them essentially on a blank sheet, right? And then the fact that the federal government is basically willing to write a blank check and subsidize this to the tune of maybe $10 billion a year, that's like an aircraft carrier, right? Like, we're going to build, I'm still in this line from Dmitry Alperovich, who's like, we're the average, new aircraft carrier is like $13 billion, essentially. That's essentially what we're going to have to spend to build, these advanced chip fabs. And the question is, which is a strategic better use of money, right? Hard to say, but you could make the argument maybe the $10 billion on a chip fab's worth it more for a strategic sort of autonomy. Now, I don't think it's going to. An important thing is efficiency gain in terms of yield is not the same thing as scale. Right. So that fab is not going to replace our dependence on Taiwan by any means. Right. There's no way this is just one fab is going to replace our supply chain requirements. It's really useful for, the strategic parts of our demand. Right. For, say, F-35, for certain other military applications where you want assured supply. And so that helps de-risk on the margin some of the acute military dependencies we have on Taiwan. But in terms of the basic, logic that still makes Taiwan a strategic hinge point is not going away. Because the whole economy requires TSMC chips. And the whole economy is not going to get TSMC chips from Arizona, I'll tell you that. So this is it's a good marginal improvement, but it's it costs a lot of money, and we can bring all those engineers here. That's our ace in the hole. We can import thousands of Taiwanese engineers, and we can write basically a blank check. So it's a W to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, I was shocked because I thought the speed at which, that was announced last year, maybe 2 years ago. And they're saying like 2026 was when it would be.
I mean, they had the plans for it. But yeah, I think they, at a certain point, you cut enough red tape. And it's not like a hard thing to do in terms of basic building. Like Elon built the mega cluster I think it was in Memphis.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned into the largest single AI training cluster to date built. And I think from like getting the final permits to like get the site, start moving things onto the site to when it was like turned on and starting training, it was like less than a month. I want to say it was like 20 something days.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Something insane, right? Like a crazy absolute feat of engineering of just like just moving millions of pounds of like high, very expensive equipment into place, very sensitive stuff. Now I think chip fab's even more sensitive. Probably can't build obviously that fast. But like when there's a will, there's a way. Yeah, so like, it's good, but I think people were over-indexing on like, oh yeah, like Taiwan's effed now. I think people were vastly overestimating.
People were quote tweeting.
People were overestimating like that. Oh, like this means that we can just let Taiwan go, right? Like, oh yeah, like there's no consequence to letting China take Taiwan if we've got this Arizona facility. That would not be the correct inference I would draw. I'm sure the Pentagon was happy because they're like, the sooner we get essentially an assured supply of chips for some of our strategic platforms, the better. But I'm not sure it changes the calculations inside Redmond, inside, Apple headquarters, because that ain't going to meet the demand for iPhone 17 or, the next gen GPUs, etc.
Yeah. It was a pleasant surprise to see that headline yesterday.
We can build things as America.
Yeah.
But it also was funny, it was like people like, I don't know, like you pat yourself on the back. America did this. When it was like, America wrote the checks, cut the red tape, and then the Taiwanese engineers did the thing. Right? It was like, these guys are the ones like, wasn't like a bunch of, American semiconductor engineers were like, we're going to build with our own brawn and brain, this, next gen fab in the desert. It was like a bunch of these like, just absolute Chad Taiwanese engineers that just work 20 hours a day that are like, you're going to pay me $500,000 a year? Well, fine. I'll get you that thing. Right. Like I'll do it. And I think there was some like early stories about some cultural issues, which would be expected because these guys were coming. They're being like, sorry, you don't get your iPhone break. You don't get, like we're working on the weekend here, Zoomer. Like, so it took a while for that culture to kind of penetrate. And I think once it did, it was like, oh, like this is how you have an effective operation. It's like there's no fat, right? It is ruthless.
Well, that's part of the reason why I was surprised because I remember I think only like 6, maybe 8 months ago, you had the headlines of like the problems you're explaining.
Mm-hmm.
They were like the DEI guidelines set forth by OSHA or whoever just did not compute with what needed to get done. And I thought the project was being set back materially from a timeline perspective. And so when the headline came out yesterday, I was like, holy shit.
I think American capitalism, to a certain extent, is still self-correcting, right? Mm-hmm. And stories like that help in terms of being like, no, guys, like, nah, this ain't. We're not tolerating this. Like, we got a deadline. Like, it's you're either in or you're out, and we're crushing it here. That's a similar thing that like, I don't know, Elon's management style, I don't know personally, but like that's the culture he's established is like a bunch of engineers, and the expectation is like you get it done as quickly as humanly possible, and like failure is just you iterate immensely quickly. And you got to respect that sort of managerial competence. It just is what it is. You can dislike his politics, you can dislike his personality, but like those sorts of systems are highly effective.
The proof is in the pudding.
Proof is in the pudding. It's like, hey, like instead of, okay, maybe we don't want to, Elon is a flawed person like every other person is. But like, at least let's not like, there are lessons here to draw in other aspects of life. Like, I want to know like, who's the senior manager on that Taiwanese construction team, right? Like, where's his profile? Like, find that guy or her guy, or her, I don't know. But like, find that person, interview them, be like, how'd you do this? Right? Like, how can we apply that lesson elsewhere? And it's probably not going to come out of some McKinsey case study, right? Like these people have, they're not the source of that sort of.
Maybe we need to get them on TFTC. Freaks.
I would.
Homework. Go find the guy. Bring him to me. I need to get him on the show. It is. That's why I love talking to you. Like help level me. But I have been more optimistic recently than I have been in years, and it's a combination of that headline, SpaceX, seems like narrative-wise and public sentiment-wise, things are definitely shifting where people are recognizing that things aren't all well and we need to solve the problem. And I think there is a problem in the first place that needs to be solved, and it feels like momentum is beginning to point in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, that's also, I think, what differentiates, in my view, like the sort of inherent Bitcoin versus gold ethos, where like sort of, I don't want to overly psychologize or piss off all the gold bugs, but like the inherent ethos of a default of I'd say the median gold bug is like, it's an insurance policy against the failure of every institution. And, that tends to make you much more like a prepper mode of like things breaking, things falling apart, things just like going pear-shaped. Whereas I think Bitcoiners, which, at least the asset class is like fundamentally similar in its structural relationship to global economic and institutional risk or uncertainty, but like the ethos is much more like progressive and optimistic about the future. It's like, this is a new thing that is in the process of growing and being adopted around the world. And it carries with it this inherent kind of like positive energy. And I think it's better to always like look and reinforce any social or technological trends that have that kind of dynamic, right? That have that kind of creative, future-oriented, positive, even optimistic mentality to it. Because then you can actually get, people motivated to build things that they otherwise wouldn't and contribute to a collective vision that otherwise wouldn't be realized. So yeah, I think those are why like people want to be inspired by big things and big accomplishments. And they don't just want to be, feeling despair at their sense of powerlessness in the face of kind of faceless and decrepit institutions, or they much rather like build something and contribute to something that is a source of growth or rebirth or innovative energy. So yeah, I think I align with that ethos certainly, and so wherever that aligns with like these different initiatives, I think it's like it's a natural coalition, right? I think that's what you're pointing at. It's like people that kind of have this. It's like it's vibe. It's like a positive vibe. It's like a good vibe, right? Like don't be a negative Nancy. And I was probably negative Nancy the first part of this call, because you're gonna be realistic with like the situation. But then like your orientation to it is all about, okay, how do I like build something or solve that problem? And yeah, I think Bitcoiners were probably there before, right? EAC, right? Whatever it is now, that's like the Silicon Valley vibe on it. And I think there's some alignment there in some ways. But also I think I try to calibrate that at the same time, because I also see these like sort of mimetic vibes take place, and a bunch of fraud, just like bullshit artists kind of jump on the bandwagon, and it just becomes like this another form of like social signaling
it's like the crypto industry. That's what.
Yeah, it's just like, oh yeah, I've got my like I'm doing deep tech, blah blah blah, and it's like, no, you're not. You're just a shit poster on Twitter, and you just post AI generated memes. It's like, go for it, bro. Like, yeah, there's a lot of this is like people trying to align themselves with some fictional social community, and also I see this take place in like the Gundo Valley, right? Which is this sort of off-growth of the sort of deep tech EACC kind of subculture, where a bunch of like 20-somethings tech bro oriented sort of social groups creating startups in El Segundo Valley, and they're all focused on defense stuff ish, right? Whether it's drones or even like cloud seeding. I've seen one of these things, and they have a certain like aesthetic, right?
Smoking cigarettes, lifting weights.
Yeah, smoking cigarettes, kind of mullets, like like reflective sort of wraparound sunglasses. Bros on their camping kind of trip, kind of vibe. And I get it, man. Everyone needs to bond over some shared, in-group kind of vibe. But I just look at that and I'm like, just go into your garage and build the thing, right? Like, you don't need to tweet about it. And it's like, if you're tweeting about it, it's probably because you're trying to impress some VC, future VC, and you're trying to inflate, that you align with this new source of money, right? Basically, at the end of the day, everyone's just trying to get rich. And this is seen as like the next sort of play to sort of build a startup, get some in-group hype about it, get the word of mouth going to those, relatively small handful of VCs that are sort of throwing money into this ecosystem, and you can sort of catch that wave. And even if you've got a bunch of bullshit vaporware, that's fine. That's never been any problem, right? So like, I'm a bit cynical in some way. At the same time, I see this positive energy. I see it also creating this sort of
noise. There's always
this noise, yeah. Right? And I think people don't really want to call that out because it's seen as like, oh, you're deflated. You're crunching my vibe, man, right? Like, but some of those people are just absolute, frauds and shitheads.
Yeah. No, and they should be called out because the stakes, as you said, we're riding this exponential curve, and the stakes are getting exponentially higher, and we don't have time for any more SBFs or Adam Nallmans or Elizabeth Holmes. We got to get shit done. And
I mean, it's fascinating. If you remember the financial, I don't know if we talked about this last time, so cut me off if this will be redundant, but in the March 2023 banking failures, right, it turned out that Silicon Valley Bank was one of the largest sources of venture finance to a whole swath of like deep tech defense-oriented VCs that had made all these, investments in all these different companies. And when they're going, bankrupt that weekend, the Defense Department like freaked out. They were like, holy crap, right? Like, all of these companies, which were like, which we had sort of sold our leadership on, is like, this is the new hotness, all these drone stuff, all this AI, autonomous, jibba jabba, like, it's going to come out of this new ecosystem that we're helping to seed. And it was like, what? All those companies might go bankrupt, next week. And they lost their shit. And they were like, how do we bail these people out, basically? And they looked around and, there's certain credit facilities that the Pentagon has. One is like the Office of Strategic Capital, for example. They've recently stood up and they've given it maybe $1 billion, a little bit more than that maybe now. And they were like, okay, can we just like use this capital to like bail out these companies? And that was a true case study to me, is like, this is where push comes to shove. Getting back to the earlier part of the conversation, like the structure of allocation of credit and who gets bailed out, right? It's a different type of people that are going to get bailed out now, right? And I think the same sort of moral hazard that the Bitcoiners learned, and what kind of motivated Bitcoin, right, is like the 2008 bailouts, et cetera. Oh, the big bankers, those get bailed out. Now in a geopolitical competition dynamic, it's probably the same types, but then other folks now that are like looking to position themselves to be strategically, too big to fail, right? Or too important to fail. And so the game now is kind of the same game that was, in the too big to fail era. It's like, how do you get yourself in a position where you're too big to fail, where you've got essentially this yellow socialism, floor to your losses and uncapped gains. And so a lot of the VC class, they're not dumb, right? They're like, how do I get essentially a put? How do I get like a Defense Department sort of call option, right? How do I like get that sort of moral hazard embedded into my business model? And that's, to me, is like, it's just an inevitable feature when you get, whether it's the Treasury Department or the Fed or the Defense Department in the private sector, is now their preferred investments and where their strategic prerogatives distort those private incentives. And then everyone else then has to then adapt, right? If you don't play that game, you're going to lose. So then everyone has to play that game. And then eventually the whole system of private, capital allocation gets distorted. But to me, I don't see that being recognized as much because it's got this like mimetic vibe attached to it of American Renaissance. And, it's
got a pretty facade.
Pretty facade. It's like, oh, Palmer Luckey isn't like Goldman Sachs. Palmer Luckey is Palmer Luckey. He's a cool guy.
He's got a Hawaiian shirt on. He's wearing flip-flops.
Like his incentives are his incentives. He's building cool stuff. And he's certainly innovative. But is the Defense Department ever going to let Anduril not get preferred access to cheap credit? I guarantee you that's a strong, like reinforcement support to his business relative to competitors, and VCs would love to get, say, co-investment from, say, In-Q-Tel or other, intelligence and defense related sources of capital, which are not, necessarily ROI oriented, right? They're strategically oriented. And so it's a really good thing if you're a private investor looking for a 10, 50x exit to have a co-investor in the sort of the capital stack that doesn't care about return, right? They're happy to eat losses. They're happy to double down to keep a strategic potential, tech investment alive. And I do worry actually that like we're generating a whole bunch of like vaporware shit, right? That looks cool. They got really good marketing, really good Twitter vibes. All the VCs and everyone is just going to be like, has no incentive to like pop each other's balloon. And because most of the tech is fundamentally not like a marketable, app or whatever, where there's like, okay, when you launching, what's your daily active user number? What's your conversion rate? What's your, growth plan to profit, et cetera, et cetera. It's all just like, I got this buddy in a senior acquisition role inside the Pentagon who's going to give me a $100 million contract in 2 years, and then we're good. And you're like, okay. Yeah. and then when we go to war with China, like we all just get endless buckets of money poured on us. So that's the incentive right now that's in place. And so I don't know. Again, me just rambling and talking shit from the cheap sheets, I guess.
No, it's funny too. In the case of Silicon Valley Bank, it's extremely ironic, considering the fact that like concentration risk is always top of mind for VCs, and they were all concentrated the risk on that one bank.
And they all chase the same sort of hype stuff. It's all vibes. Everyone just that works on vibes now, and sometimes it's rational to work on vibes. I mean, look at them; they're worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and I'm not. So good for them.
No, I think it is important to call this out and be cognizant, because like similar to the conversation we were having earlier with linear and lateral thinkers, like you need a good mix of those type of thinkers, and in this case, you need a good mix of actual innovation and products being brought to market and vibes that help communicate what is happening there and getting people optimistic about it.
And if I was, if I was like, okay, what's the highest ROI, to spend, or what's the most effective thing we could be doing to improve our advantage over China? I mean, there's probably a few different ones you could pick, but like the one that I see up close is just on the cyber side, right? Like China is in wide swaths of our critical infrastructure. And these are privately owned and operated networks for the most part. And they have a strategic military doctrine of holding those systems at risk for the purposes of both interrupting our ability to mobilize forces in a crisis and or conflict, and to instill social panic. So that means targeting, supporting infrastructure, water, electrical, ports around our military facilities, in Guam, on the West Coast, and then sort of opportunistic targeting of other private critical infrastructure networks throughout the country. And I talked to a lot of these companies and critical infrastructure providers and the senior security leadership, and they recognize it's an issue, but there is no, I would say, structural incentive for a lot of them to prioritize their scarce budgets to go after what is a very hard problem, trying to identify and kick out the Chinese, and do that almost on a continuous basis from their systems. But like that is what will strategically deter us in a Taiwan conflict. And all the whiz-bang stuff Anduril has is going to be rendered moot if a political decision maker is basically facing an environment where, domestically, they have to respond to the urgency of, civil unrest and mobilizing troops, if you even can, with interruptions to, say, the Civil Reserve Air Fleet or movements out of our domestic ports and bases into theater become hampered. You might not even get to the point where our troops are mobilized into the South China Sea or into the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah, because it gets so bad domestically, it's like, all right, just take Taiwan, please turn.
And that's their explicit objective. And senior government officials have gone public and said, we are not able to deter China from this behavior, and we have not been able to sufficiently motivate the private sector to take it seriously as a threat. So here we are in the situation where the U.S. government is admitting the strategic deterrence from this highly credible cyber threat to our critical infrastructure is not something that they, as the U.S. government, can effectively protect those networks from. And then the people that are responsible for securing those networks don't have the incentive or the capability to do it. And so I'm like, guys, like, that's the problem. But that's not a sexy thing. That doesn't get you, the vibe in the American Renaissance crew. Because it's just kind of like, it's tough, right? There's no easy thing. And you're talking to CISOs, you're talking to security teams who've got these legacy networks to try to manage, and ransomware, and 17-year-olds in Belarus pwning them every other day, right? Like that's what their day to day is focused on. This future crisis event where China could just flip the switch is it's rational for them to a certain extent to kind of push it off and make it somebody else's problem. But it leads to this kind of collective action issue for our national security. And there's some investments, my company does some of this in terms of cybersecurity and geopolitical, risk management, et cetera. But it's like an omnipresent issue, and the scale of China's forces are extremely large and vastly outnumber defenders in the West. And so, I see all these people talking about China competition and countering China and building fancy drones and getting $1 million contracts. And that's one strategy, but it's like, is that moving the strategic needle, right? Is China really worried about Anduril's wingman thing?
They're working at higher layers that can be completely rendered moot, as you said, if the foundational layer is exploited in the way that it can be.
I don't think it's a checkmate. Everything is a matter of balance, right? But our system right now has this reinforcing incentive in many ways to invest in show versus real, versus investing in the image of capability versus the actual
projection
resilience, right? Like real resilience, real security is kind of not sexy. It's not some fancy new thing. It's doubling down on known things that are just take competence, consistency, execution, prioritization. But it's not the new cool thing, right?
I don't know if this could get you in trouble or.
That's a good way to start a question.
It's a smart question, but do we have
spicy?
Do we have equivalent capabilities with China's infrastructure? Is there a Mexican standoff where it's like, hey, because I've never heard it talked about. Have we infiltrated their systems?
We're not going to enhance our offensive cyber capabilities, which you can imagine are quite robust.
Yeah.
What's different is our operational military doctrine in terms of target selection and rules of engagement. And I think the precise contours of this are classified, but I think it's pretty clear to my understanding that we wouldn't have as broad a set of targets for disruptive or destructive cyber attacks in a crisis or a conflict as China does for us.
Okay.
So there is a bit of asymmetry, not in terms of capability per se, but in terms of
what one's willing to do.
Willingness to hit an entire city in the middle of nowhere, right? Just to kind of mess with China. Who knows? In the exigencies of conflict, those things could change or whatever. But I think right now, the norms of cyber warfare are still very much in flux and not very well established. And the structure of cyber deterrence is still a very unsettled kind of vague concept or kind of discourse. And this gets a little bit in the weeds of Rethinking Cyber Warfare is a book I have right over here, which is just about this, which is how do you actually think about cyber warfare as a thing? And it's different than, say, nuclear war, where there's, certain elaborate analysis of kind of mutually assured destruction, game theoretic mechanisms of deterrence, like counterforce, countervalue targeting, creates a strategic equilibrium where that I know that I could kill you, and that I know that you could kill me back if I hit you, and so we all have an incentive not to kill each other, right? And so whereas cyber warfare, because it's hard to attribute with high confidence, and so you don't necessarily know immediately who did it, right? You might suspect, but is that suspicion sufficiently credible enough for policymakers to escalate along that path, right? and the attacker has every incentive to kind of obfuscate maybe it was the North Koreans that wanted to make it look like it was the Chinese. And until are you gonna like retaliate, right? And so these are the things where and it's also like, what is a we call like asymmetric escalation. Like, what's an equivalent thing that we would do, maybe not in the cyber domain, but in maybe the economic domain with sanctions, or even in the military domain with like a kinetic strike somewhere? That would be like what we would consider like a proportional response to a cyber attack on an American city's water supply, right? Like, what's the equivalent there? Do we hit their water supply? But there's sort of human rights issues, Geneva Convention, law of war stuff. Like if you talk to lots of military and intelligence planners, like you kind of realize that like lawyers run the show like now, right? Like you think, oh, it's the CIA in the back of the 60s, they're just coups everywhere. Like Ted Shackley is just killing people, off of like a memo, right? Like nowadays there's like lawyers everywhere that like have to vet and validate and approve everything that these agencies do. So like it's become actually an issue now. In fact, I think this could be a change depending on who comes in on the cyber side under Trump, where like offensive cyber operations under cyber command, like there's quite a restriction now in place on what sorts of private networks can you leverage. Like cyber attacks this is getting a little bit technical. It's not like a missile you're flying, right? You're usually going over and through sometimes allied networks, sometimes third-party systems, sometimes critical private sector networks to get to your target, different command and control systems that you have to set up. And you don't necessarily know exactly, it's hard to predict what like the quote blast radius is, right? You hit a missile, you've modeled out, right? This is basically the kill box. This is like collateral damage. You can model that, you can predict it, you can tell the decision maker, you launch that missile, this is the, expected effect, accepted collateral damage, et cetera. With cyber, especially when you're hitting critical infrastructure, there's all sorts of cascading things like, oh, we didn't mean to knock out the power to that hospital, but that's what happened. And then now that their generator, which we thought would kick in, didn't kick in. And now you've got 20 babies on ventilators that die, right? Like that's now the consideration of if you're using these sorts of capabilities in a conflict. It's very fuzzy, very hard. And we're very litigious, bureaucratic systems. So China doesn't actually have as many of those compunctions. And so that's a long-winded way of saying that, like, it would be very messy, and this is not well-established terrain. And because of that very fact, there isn't really a credible deterrence in place, is basically the upshot. It's not like nuclear weapons where, oh, if they hit us, they know we're going to hit them. And it kind of leads to this strategic balance where we're probably safe, right, from nuclear war unless things really go wrong. Whereas with these sorts of cyber attacks on domestic critical infrastructure, I wouldn't have nearly as much confidence in that like deterrence framework, especially given the fact that China's kind of telegraphed this. Like this is in their doctrine, and they're making kind of a show in certain ways of being in these networks with the explicit purpose of taking them out, and kind of proving to our population, and our political leadership that they could. That's kind of the point.
Yeah.
Of it. So, anyways,
scary stuff. Very scary stuff. We didn't even get to UAPs, and I know you're gonna run, but
I'm good if you want to keep going for a bit.
All right.
You tell me when you want to. I'm good for.
I love bringing you on. The last two times, this is the second time. First time I brought you on, wanted to talk disclosure. This time, wanted to do the whole episode on disclosure, but you have such a breadth of knowledge and all these other things. I just inevitably
rabbit holes.
Jump down all these rabbit holes. Disclosure. Disclosure seems like your guilty pleasure outside of all this work, or does it fit into all of this as well?
I don't know if I have a way to rationally embed it in any consistent way. It's just sort of happened. I could reconstruct where I got to where I got, but I don't think it was like a planned, but somehow now I'm in a position, I have met a number of people, had a number of conversations that I've just been forced to reconcile my worldview in, a variety of ways to, the fact that non-human intelligence is real, that it has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is ongoing, and there's elements of what you would call our defense and intelligence and defense industrial system that has been aware of that for a long time. Exactly how much they know, exactly what they know, I don't have a high confidence assessment of that. But that core set of things, that core set of propositions, is at issue, and that's sort of like the lump in the throat, right? That's the kidney stone that we're struggling to pass as a society, as a political system, and we're in the middle of that kidney stone passing. If that's maybe an uncomfortable metaphor, I guess it should be. And yeah, so that's where we are. Disclosure, capital D, whatever, this whole thing is kind of a semantic debate, is obscuring what I think is really the critical issue, which is what's happening inside Congress, what's happening behind the scenes in a number of these briefings and submissions to members of Congress, committees in Congress, that attest to and provide evidence to validate that those sorts of that set of core propositions I just stated, which is really just me quoting a senior Army Colonel Carl Nell, who I believe has firsthand knowledge of these programs, and was helping to push what has been termed the UAP Disclosure Act in Congress. So we'll see. I mean, the next thing to look forward to in terms of the political side of this. Right now, it looks like there are going to be hearings in Congress on November 13th. Actually, it'll be hosted under the House Cybersecurity sort of Information Technology Subcommittee, of all things. Crossover from our conversation.
Are you going to go to this hearing?
I don't know. I'm not testifying. I'll tell you that. I'm not a witness. We'll see if my calendar is clear. I can actually go physically. But I'll probably be watching it for sure. And I know that the objective for that conference or for that committee hearing is to have new information be testified to by people with significant experience. Again, we're in the kind of throes of as you get closer to an event like that, you can imagine, there's lots of people would rather that not happen. And so I think there's all sorts of maneuvers being executed to try to stop that or cull certain witnesses, et cetera. Again, it's a matter of power politics to see who shows up and what they say at this point. But it's clear that we now have this factional battle playing out, right? Like that's obvious. You can sort of see it between the folks who would rather this information, or at least a large portion of information, not come out in a certain way, and the people who would. And this is the bargaining process that's playing out. Lou Elizondo is an important individual to pay attention to. His book Imminent is I'd say very important read, and he's going to be starting a national tour very soon talking about this. And yeah, this is going to be a thing we're just going to have to adjust to over the next. I always hate to give timelines, but it's only going to become more and more salient in our policy and public and social discourse. Everything is consumed now by the election. Just it's impossible for anything to break through, right? So election, we'll see what happens with the election. We'll see what happens with the new Congress. And then next year we'll roll into, normal politics, still craziness. But this will be climbing into discourse. There's lots of questions everyone has, right? Like
what has already been laid bare, and what do you expect will be laid bare? I know you said you don't have supreme knowledge of everything, but I know that you've been talking to a lot of people and have some ideas about, and what are the ramifications for a man with a wife and 2 young children?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'd say there's 2 basic classes of ways information is coming out. One is like in what you call like official processes, meaning official, say either FOIA documents that get released, official declassified records that go into the National Archive, which is now required by law. So those are starting to flow into a repository hosted at the National Archives, Library of Congress. It's on the internet. You can start looking at it now. And new documents are starting to be declassified by the cognizant agencies that hold these records, are required by law to upload these documents. Now, I don't expect those documents to be like the motherlode, disclosure pieces of evidence, but it's sort of the trickle that is now happening, and then the logical extrapolation or expansion of that sort of formal official process would be subject to the passage of something like the UAP Disclosure Act, which was introduced by Senator Schumer, Senator Rounds last year, co-sponsored by Gillibrand, Rubio, Heinrich, Young, and was reintroduced earlier this year. Did not actually get into the National Defense Authorization Act like it did last year. There are people who believe, and it's all behind closed doors politics, that there could be an opportunity to reintroduce that language into the bill in conference committee. We'll see. There's all sorts of technical maneuvers, and leadership prerogatives that are at play when you get to that part of the sort of legislative sausage making. But in that scenario where something like the UAP Disclosure Act is passed, that sets up a much more formal and official process for an independent review board that has powers of subpoena and unilateral declassification, as well as the capacity to take eminent domain possession of, quote, non-human technologies of unknown origin associated with non-human intelligence and biological materials. That's what the law has as written states. And, you can interpret that plain language as what it's referring to. So that would be this official process of what in some circles is called controlled disclosure. The idea being that this review board that now has this, independent executive level authority to look across the entire agency and private sector, industrial, base, aerospace companies, and, essentially pull everything to them. Then they would have 9-member panel. There'd be positions of national stature to do a review and make recommendations to the president on which portions of those records and materials should be disclosed to the American people in what manner. So that literally calls for a controlled disclosure campaign plan. So that would be like the controlled official disclosure process established by law, nominated, senior people to this 7-year term at this review board. Then they go through this process and information would come out to the American public subject to presidential override. That is the process that has been developed and pushed for by a certain faction of what we call the pro-disclosure people inside the defense and intelligence communities and their allies on the Hill. So that is one track. There's a lot of grassroots momentum and try to get that passed. In some Congress, we'll see. There's another track, which is the unofficial, uncontrolled disclosure of information, right? And this is obviously much harder to point to a mechanism or a process because it's inherently uncontrolled. It's inherently subject to individuals deciding to come forward with information in what way and in what manner and what time. And so unlike a piece of law that says this has to be published in 180 days to the Congressional, to the National Archives, this would be some guy or some girl, some woman, I should say, that has held a position of senior responsibility inside the government, coming out and saying what they know. And there are certain individuals that have already done that. They just haven't been in positions of significant enough national responsibility that has triggered what I would call a belief cascade, right? Where it's the median person on social media goes, oh, that person said that. Huh, that's weird. Is this a psyop, or is he really, or he or there, or she are really telling us something? But this sort of people have moved down that trajectory. One of the most recent individual I point people to is a guy named Harold Malmgren, who, everyone knows Henry Kissinger. He, I would argue, was as influential and had as much power as Henry Kissinger did for much of the 20th century. But nobody knows his name. And that's for a reason. Harold Malmgren, well, I won't give you his full bio. You can look at his Wikipedia page. He, was one of these sort of McNamara whiz kids in the 50s, went into the Kennedy administration, was basically the guy that was, or kid, he was 26 or whatever, when he was sent to the Pentagon war room during the Cuban Missile Crisis to hold Curtis LeMay back from nuking the Soviets, which he was able to do by successfully kind of stalling Curtis LeMay and his generals who just were itching to drop something. So that's where you got to start in sort of national security apparatus. And then he has come out and he's getting up in years, and he's survived a bout of cancer, and he's moved back into DC to be at the front row for what's coming. And he's stated now on Twitter publicly, and I've had private conversations with him where he's said similar things. He said explicitly, like, non-human intelligence is real, and we have recovered vehicles, craft, as a result, and then we're working to figure out how they work. That's what he said. And he's described a few anecdotes from his career. One was when he was posted up in Los Alamos. I think it was Los Alamos. It was at least in Albuquerque, where he was sent to help do the design cost build for our first anti-ballistic missile system in 1963, which at the time was actually nuclear based, because we didn't have any other way to block, hitting nuclear missiles coming in. We were basically launching nukes at them to blow them up in space. And so he was sent there to basically help figure out what that system should do and how to build it. And so he had all the clearances for our nuclear weapons, Department of Energy clearances, as well as, our top secret war plans, et cetera. So he was among the most cleared people. And he had meetings out there with a guy named Lawrence Geis, who's the director of the Western Division of the Atomic Energy Commission, who had responsibility over all those labs, Sandia, Los Alamos, et cetera. And Lawrence Geis, who actually turned out to be the grandfather by marriage/adoption of Jeff Bezos, of all people, he told Harold Malmgren that they were working on reverse engineering UFO objects that they had retrieved. Told him that in 1963. And then sometime later, in a separate context, he had a private briefing with the essentially number 2 guy at the CIA named Richard Bissell, who was kind of like the guy that got stuff done. He stood up Area 51, created kind of all of our, all the CIA's special aerospace projects, from then on, and was managing a lot of the covert action stuff from the 60s on. He had a private briefing with Richard Bissell. Richard Bissell told him of the same thing, that they were working on reverse engineering what Richard Bissell called other world technologies. So this is what Harold Malmgren has said now in public. I know he knows a lot more than that, but that's what he said. And he's just an example of an individual that has held senior position, and he went on to serve multiple presidents. He was a chief economic advisor, international trade negotiations. This guy was a polymath, served multiple presidents, but he was a man behind the scenes, was never trying to get public attention or build power for himself like Kissinger was. He was kind of the shadow Kissinger, who had the back channels to the Soviets at the most senior levels, and then back channels to a lot of other countries from the 60s really through the 70s. And then became a international consultant to a bunch of Japanese conglomerates in the 80s, et cetera, and GM and all these big powerhouse companies. So he's a super well connected guy, one of the more well respected sort of geopolitical, trade, economics, national security folks. And he's just come out and just said it hard in the paint. This is real. We've been figuring this stuff out. Most people don't know who Harold Malmgren is, don't know his career, don't know what he's done or what he's seen or how respected he is in different corridors of power. So they haven't really assumed that into their, update, that Bayesian update in this thing, which I agree, for everyone has to start very, very low and then only climbs in a gradual fashion, as you appraise what amounts to right now is circumstantial testimony, right, from people that may be in position to know, right? So this is the trajectory we're on, where people that are in those close circles of trust that by happenstance you happen to develop, I'd say, a higher credence in this set of somewhat disconcerting information than the average person, just because it hasn't penetrated kind of the social media, mainstream media bubble yet, because we haven't had that person, that household name type person, come out and say something similar. So that's kind of where we are in waiting for, if the official process doesn't play out the way that it could play out if certain things happen in Congress, then you're in this unofficial process, which is by definition kind of less controlled, less predictable. And you could see information come out in a much more disjunctive fashion, where individuals just decide, I'm coming up at the end of my life, or I believe this is the right moment, or for whatever reason, I'm just going to come out and say what I have to say. And so that could happen. I've heard there's individuals like this that are prepared to come forward. Until they do, though, it's kind of like a personal decision at their discretion. Some people say it's more confident. I have no idea, right? But it's like, I'll see when I see it. But as someone who looks around different corners and tries to predict the what ifs, I'm at the point now where I have to like factor that into my like decision tree of like possible scenarios. Like, what if someone like this said this type of thing? What might that trigger? How would our society react to it? And then, more on the, personal side of like, the real tough nugget here is like, what the heck is actually going on here? Right. And that's another 2-hour conversation, 20-hour conversation, but there is no, I think, easy answer. I think there's a reason why this has been kept secret. It's not just because we want to get some secret tech and develop an asymmetric advantage over China. It's probably a core reason, but I think there's probably other things motivating this as well. Maybe even good reasons in theory to keep it from the mass public until you have a plan to communicate it. And I look at certain things that Lou Elizondo has said that are, not assuring in that respect. And he said this a few times now, and every time people, uncomfortably gulp, and it's unclear how to react to it because it's so vague. But, he titled his book Imminent, for one. That's the name of his book. He's been asked about like some future event or some, scenario that would present like a destabilizing effect on society in some way. What that is, he has not given any color, but you can look at a few examples of his comments where he's referring to, where he's answering questions about those rumors of a future event. And he doesn't dismiss it by any means. He just says, I'm not approved to talk about that yet. And he's denied that, for example, just yesterday he was asked this question. This was Thursday. He was asked this question about like, is the event this asteroid that might do a flyby of Earth in 2027? And he goes, no, it has nothing to do with that. And then he goes, beyond that, I can't talk about it. I was like, so there actually isn't it. I was like, so there's an it that you can't talk about that refers to some future event that potentially help, inform why you called your book Imminent. It's like, bro, like that's, I don't know. Like, I understand he has reasons. He has left and right bounds about what he can or cannot say. But I know for the people that pay attention to the UFO stuff, which some are very professional and some are minor, but some are not necessarily psychologically even keeled. That's like kerosene on the fire, man. That's like, holy shit. Like, what are you talking about? You talking about like an invasion? Are you talking about like, what are you talking about, bro?
What does your gut say? Are we like in the middle of a 3 bodies like story where there's an alien race coming to take over our planet because theirs has been destroyed? Is it simply tech that allows us to explore the stars and we need to figure out how we handle that? Is it Anunnaki? Are they living among us?
I mean, again, you're hitting on all the canonical kind of tropes. Yeah. And I think because we've been in an information vacuum, people have constructed elaborate scenarios and stories, what amount to almost UFO folklore at this point. And individuals with firsthand experience that they say reinforces a certain number of those folklore. I am like fundamentally agnostic with respect to all of that at this point. I can construct all sorts of different scenarios in my mind, but I have like very thin like anchors of hard evidence. And even among the, high confidence conversations I've had, like nothing has really given me any better way to steer. Other than, I have more of a first principles assessment, which is like basically just combining the two things that I think are more likely true, which is one, like this interaction, for the lack of a better term, is not new. In the sense, didn't just start, 1940s when we started dating. It's been persistent throughout human history, maybe even throughout history of life on Earth, and therefore I don't think that it's like we just happen to live at like the one fraction of that entire history that something different is going to happen, right? It could be, right, but like. You have to then make a separate argument that it's because of our technological development, it's because of reaching some takeoff with AI or space exploration or
new energy. That's been one of the Bitcoin theories, and Drew Bunsall has joked is like once you discover like that's when you when you discover something like Bitcoin, you can prove that you can create this somewhat incorruptible monetary system. You were then invited to join the intergalactic community in the cosmos.
I mean, it's a great story. I mean,
Yeah.
and in fact, there are people with immense professional bona fides, like a gentleman named Haim Ashed, who was the father of the Israeli Space Force. Like among the most decorated, most senior. He was a physicist, built their most secret military space projects. Was like top of the pile. He wrote a book actually in Hebrew. And it was, I don't think actually even a full translation has been made, but like partial transcript of some interviews he's given, where he's just outright says, yeah, like we've had interaction with representatives of the, like, I don't know what the translation are, but like Galactic Federation. Bonkers stuff. But he said it. This is a guy who's just like, he's top of the pile in the Israeli space technology scientific hierarchy. And he's just like, I'm just going to put it out there. But it was so bonkers and nobody had any reference point. And they really didn't explain it anymore. It's just like, yeah, like, this is it. This is what's been happening. Like, peace. And I was like, okay, like, let's just put that over there. Let's not, put any particular weight on it. But he said it. So, yeah, I mean, once you start going down this tree, you have to contemplate a variety of sci-fi kind of scenarios, and it's difficult to get a good grasp on what's really going on. But I also think, I mean, this is, I guess it goes really far deep, but like, I think to really understand what might be happening with any advanced intelligence, it by assumption means that whatever we're interacting with has knowledge of the nature of reality that we don't have, and therefore has also exploited that knowledge into, what we would consider magical technology, but is really just some way of exploiting the degrees of freedom that the universe allows intelligence to exploit. And that could radically violate, certain paradigms that we've just grown accustomed to, informed by our current scientific understanding of reality. But that shouldn't be a surprise, because that's what science has done to us over the last few hundred years, right? Every major revolution, starting with like Copernicus, has like radically revised our sense of like where we are in reality, what's possible in reality, what are the rules that govern reality, and therefore like what technology can we build? And that's all human civilization has really been doing for the last few hundred years, is like bootstrapping ourselves up from fundamental physics knowledge to technology to like expanding our civilization and just like doing cool shit. So we have a certain embedded sense of assumptions about local realism and sort of locality of physical and causal interactions, the smoothness of, a 3+1 dimensional manifold that we are embedded in. And this sort of spookiness of quantum mechanics is there, but, we don't really need to care about in our everyday life. But I think by assumption, like any advanced intelligence is playing in the spookiness. They're playing in that zone of reality that we don't really have a good handle on now. And so any attempt to kind of model what's happening, right, fundamentally isn't just going to be like a probe from another star, I think. Right? It's going to be a little bit weird. It might be a probe from a star, but the science that it's leveraging to get here is going to take advantage of knowledge that to us is sort of incomprehensible, or would require us really stretching our current conceptual frameworks of fundamental physics. And so that's why I think these go hand in hand, of like really investing in expanding the boundaries of our current fundamental physics knowledge is going to be sort of essential to understand this NHI thing. It isn't just going to come from, I think, daddy government being like, we figured it all out, we've just been keeping it a secret, and here you go. Here's like an easy cheat sheet for the American public to read that's like, yep, this is the new thing, you just got to fold it in there. Because, trying to explain quantum mechanics to the average person is just not an easy thing to do, right? But you don't really have to, because nobody needs to know about quantum mechanics, right? Unless you're engineering, semiconductors, whatever, and then you're fine. You're just build the stuff. But this might be a thing that like requires us trying to communicate aspects of reality that are more like in the language of fundamental physics, and really stretching our vocabularies and our mental models and even our religious or spiritual metaphysical frameworks. And that's a tough task. And honestly, from my perspective, that's not really the function of government to do, right? Like the government shouldn't be the one, and I wouldn't trust the government to give people like that capital T truth whatever it is that they're putting down on that briefing. It's like, actually, no, here's the nature of reality. We learned it from the alien god. It's like, hey, buddy, I need to do this again. I'm gonna a second opinion, I think.
Well, that drives into the other question. Like, how do we know we're not getting duped by Project Bluebeam or something like that, right? Because that's been a theory for a while, is that this narrative is going to be used to control humans, and it's really not real, but you can create a narrative and get enough people of stature to beat the drum on the narrative to make people believe it's real, but it's just used as this control mechanism.
I mean, this is certainly, you have to factor in as part of all this is like, there's certainly propaganda and manipulation happening regardless, right? It's like, either the government or some subsets of the government are trying to manipulate some people into believing aliens are real when they're not, or there's parts of the government that are trying to manipulate people into believing they're not real when they are. And there might even be groups doing both at the same time, right? And I actually believe there probably are groups doing both at the same time, right? And in fact, there's evidence for that, right? Where the Air Force Office of Special Investigations has actually used essentially UFO as a cover story for truly secret, real, Air Force projects, right? The famous case in UFO circles is Richard Doty, and this scientist that was monitoring an Air Force base thought he saw like weird stuff, and he was like, getting attention for it. And the Air Force basically deluded this guy into thinking that he was seeing was actually UFOs. And that he was getting he was being fed information from an Air Force intelligence officer that was complete nonsense, fake information. He ended up killing himself. So not a great outcome. But there's a case study where like the Air Force and elements of the government have used UFOs as a psychological manipulation to cover perfectly, conventional secret programs. So there's like evidence of that, right? I think though that's not, if you actually look into what's been happening, right? Like actually tracking the details, that is not a sufficient explanation by any means to what is really going on here, between what's happening in Congress and various other witnesses and whistleblowers and people associated with these legacy programs. So this is where in counterintelligence, as James Jesus Angleton called it, like it's a wilderness of mirrors, right? Like it's very difficult to ascertain like ground truth. What's a counterintelligence reflection off a real program that is, like I can imagine like, just to paint a scenario here, there are special access programs. The government has these. There's normal conventional special access programs. There's unacknowledged special access programs that we don't acknowledge or admit they exist. And then there's waived unacknowledged special access programs, which we also don't even brief on paper to the senior leadership in Congress. They get like a verbal briefing only on those things. So imagining a scenario where you have that super secret waived unacknowledged special access program, any such program has a counterintelligence team assigned to it whose job it is to like create very plausible deceptions to cover the mission and even existence of that program from adversaries or anybody else. And so their job is to constantly monitor for any references to that program or anyone that might come in contact with it and feed them nonsense information about it, right? Either making it look, even potentially use UFOs because you're like, hey, yeah, this is actually the UFO program. And then anyone who talks about it looks like a loon, right? It throws everyone off the scent. And you can imagine a scenario where like that's happening. And then that conventional, say, waived unacknowledged special access program is actually being used to cover secret R&D on like conventional programs, for hypersonic, whatever, space, whatever. We do a bunch of secret stuff, right? But then you can imagine a scenario where like that conventional waived unacknowledged special access program has a subcompartment that most of the other people in that, in that WUSAP don't know about, that is actually doing reverse engineering on, technologies of unknown origin, right? And the non-human intelligence stuff, right? So it's like you can have this like layered onion of secrecy and counterintelligence and deception that from the outside, honestly, is like epistemically impenetrable. Because any ping you try to send, it's like sending radar into the earth, right? You're getting different reflections off of the different layers, and you're trying to interpret from like the backscatter, right? Like what's the layer made of? What's behind it? What's the next layer? And you're fundamentally in a position of just fraught uncertainty. And so it's a fair position to be like, until something comes out, I'm just going to assume it's a psyop. I mean, it's like, for me, it's like more like, well, okay, but that doesn't really adjudicate where you stand, because there's probably psyops everywhere you turn, right? It's like, the question is though, at the end of the day, right, like, what is this, where's the beef, right? What does it matter for me in my life? At a certain point, it's words, it's statements, it's pictures, it's images, yada yada yada. Like, when does, you know, the stock market crash, right? When do people lose their minds, right? Or not, and people just go on with their day. And I think that will be like inherently though, like a nonlinear and like more like a 0 to 1 thing. And I don't think anyone's going to have like the heads up on that. I think that's what they're struggling with now, is that I think what's motivating some of this is that there's a belief by some individuals that there is going to be a 0 to 1 moment, and that they want to do as much as they can to sort of foam the runway to mitigate the impact of that 0 to 1. And they want to do that without necessarily precipitating a 0 to 1 before, right? That's sufficiently, before the runway is sufficiently foamed. So there's this inherent tension of like, if we just do nothing, that's like worst case scenario. If we try to do something, we could, you know, make it worse or bring it forward before we have, you know, enough preparation. So there's kind of this catch-22. I recognize that's not ideal. And for the average person in civil society, it's probably rational to like not psychologically overstress about it until you have to, because unless you can really do much, then you're just kind of like agonizing over something that's like really bizarre and hard to get your head around. But yeah, I think at least where I am at this point is like trying to rationally incorporate the relatively high confidence information into a worldview that I think I can systematically, you know, adapt myself to without, you know, being totally destabilized, and then preparing for different tail scenarios that could go in many different directions. And like, you know, life is inherently risky and uncertain, and, you know, human civilization is not, you know, fated to any destiny. So we have to make good decisions and be contemplative and open-minded on our position in the world. And I think, you know, that's, yeah, maybe the more Zen mentality is probably a healthy one, is just, you know, we should probably take a harder look at ourselves and our history, and yeah, like the fraught nature of our existence as a species, and be like, maybe we should clean up our act. It might, you know, we might get some external forcing function in that respect, but maybe better if it's self-generated. Yeah, and so there's like lots there, right? But for me, like, I'm feeling like a physics and philosophy person. Everyone right now is obsessed with technology, right? Everyone is worshiping at the altar of AI and space rockets. It's cool stuff. It's inspiring stuff. But it's fundamentally like leveraging science, physics. It's like 100 years old. Like Turing, you know, von Neumann architectures for computing, you know, basic, you know, conventional rocketry and general relativistic corrections and circuitry using quantum mechanics. This is like 100 years like old stuff. And we're just now like, you know, fully extracting the technological, you know, juice out of that science fruit. It's like we should get some new science fruit to squeeze. And I think when we do that, I think the possibility space of human civilization will make what we're currently being awed by, which it is awe-inspiring, the SpaceX rockets being captured, right? That will look like child's play, right? And so I think we should just know that that's an option for us if we really pursued it without too much bias or taboo. And so, yeah, the optimistic scenario is whatever the 0 to 1 event is, if it is even such an event, will allow us to open up that possibility space for fundamental scientific kind of paradigm shifts that would be quite transformative for our species. And that's been the trajectory we're on. We're just riding this rocket ship up, baby. There's no getting off this thing. So it's an exciting time to be alive, even if it's, you know, somewhat, you know, it's not like the 1950s, you know, sit in your white picket fence and go to your 9-to-5 job and raise your 2 kids and, you know, cash the paycheck every 2 weeks. It's going to be a different world, I think. So yeah, just strap in, you know, be healthily skeptical, but also I think, I mean, my whole thing is trying to get people to be not so surprised. I mean, that's it, right? I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. It's just more like, in the off chance that something like this does come into full view, it isn't going to be like well, what the hell? And people are like, yeah, that Pines guy said some shit about it. Like, I heard that before. It's like I got a few wheels turning already, and then you can start spinning those a bit faster, and then seek out information with a little bit, with your mindset maybe somewhat already seasoned, like as the skillet has already been seasoned a bit, and you're ready to go with whatever comes next. So I don't know. You get quite philosophical when you get down this territory here.
Yeah, it's
and I mean, it comes out of these conversations I've had, which are they start off very kind of like nuts and bolts, like what exactly is going on, the ins and outs of politics and Congress and witnesses and whistleblowers and documentaries and yada yada yada, and that's kind of like the things you can sort of throw on the board is like hard, and you can start tying the yarn against it, and then you like step back and you're like, okay, well, what the hell are you talking about, man, when you say like because it's like taking your sort of normal view on reality and being like this and that's a lot of friction in that move. And also like I don't know, I'm also hesitant to like, because of this, like human psychology, we are really vulnerable to like religious cults of all forms, and there's certain subsets of the UFO community and whatever that are like very much have like a eschatological cult vibe, and it's like the end of the world, the God savior, alien, yada yada yada. It's like a similar, I mean, even Bitcoin has some of this of like the eschatological hyper Bitcoinization will like, I'm the out group from this weird niche community, and I have a weird obsession, and we have our own canonical reference points for our belief system, and it envisages this sort of grand revelation / transformation of the global order, and people that sort of snickered and looked down and sneered, will I'll be able to say I told you so. And the true believers shall be rewarded in the aftermath, right? In the post-event, whatever transformation, right? We're all gonna get girlfriends, right? So I mean, that's a typical habit of human belief. I try to resist, and it's like you always want there to be like this event, and so I've been really resistant to that whole thing, and I've forced to have to pay attention to what someone like Lou Elizondo says, and other folks like that who allude, some more explicitly than others, in public and in private, to something like that, and I have to just like, I can't ignore it, right? But now that we're in this sort of liminal zone where it's been sort of hinted at enough by enough figures with that sort of professional authority, it's kind of we're in the most dangerous zone for the formation of those sorts of like, essentially like UFO cults, right? And then these folks become like the intelligence prophets, community prophets that are bringing down the good word of the future revelation, right? Like this, we've seen this pattern before in human belief formation. And people will go, oh, give us the tablets from the mountaintop, Joseph Smith, right? Like this is what we do. I mean, you can even see Mormonism. I don't want to offend any Mormons, but like Mormonism is essentially like a UFO cult. If you read the scripture, it's not to say it's wrong or like an illegitimate belief system. It shares a lot of the sort of morphological characteristics of that kind of theology. Yeah, and Mormonism is fascinating. If you want a whole other rant about Mormonism, just in terms of like it's structural embeddedness, and it probably has some overlap to the UFO story, but just in like the narrow intelligence community vibe, like a huge number, it's like basically a pipeline of FBI and especially CIA officers have basically come out of Mormon communities, right? Come out of Mormon colleges. And it's because, like, one, they're very clean, right? They don't do drugs, they don't drink, they don't even have caffeine. They travel the world. They have, they speak multiple languages.
Yeah.
They come from like usually a hierarchical institutional system where they're essentially defer to their leaders, right? So it's really good to have those folks inside those intelligence bureaucracies. They take instructions, yes sir. And also they're aligned with like a very wealthy, essentially like they have
a $2 trillion wealth fund.
They're enormously wealthy, and they essentially control Utah. Like Utah was originally established to be like an independent sovereign nation, and like the church.
They own most of Florida too, I'm pretty sure.
It's insane how much money they got, and you can look at American history with just through the lens of like Mormon influence. It's kind of insane. Like Howard Hughes, the famous aerospace engineer, basically built up Vegas and basically was the arm of the CIA for some of the more expensive covert operations like the Glomar Explorer, building the different special planes to facilitate all the drug trafficking kind of operations, and also facilitating the hit squads that that Nixon wanted to set up when he was the vice president. Howard Hughes was the go-between to organized crime, but Howard Hughes was surrounded by essentially Mormon handlers. So Frank Gay and his brother his last name was also Gay. They were like church elders. And towards the end of Howard Hughes' life, he became kind of delusional, schizophrenic, kind of a recluse. They sort of took over his operations, including Summa Corporation, which was like the conglomerate that was stood up. That was basically just doing a bunch of covert action shenanigans and secret technology research for the CIA. And these guys were running it essentially. And I had a cryptic tweet nobody really understood where if you actually look at Elon Musk, his like consigliere number 2, who runs his family office, runs his like private security, is actually like sits on leadership positions of SpaceX and Tesla, I believe, and Boring Company. I forget his name, blanking on it now, but he's also a church elder in the Mormon Church. And it's like, this is like a bit of a symmetry between this kind of eccentric tech billionaire with like connections to, security state, advanced technology, happens to have, a very senior Mormon guy kind of running his shop, running his money. It's like, this seems like a pattern. And last point on that, the symbol of the was called Deseret, was going to be the name of the sort of Mormon state that was going to be stood up. They actually had their own constitutional convention. It was adapted to become the state constitution of Utah. The symbol was the sort of like the beehive. And I don't know if you know, but like 15 years ago, it's now been publicly reported, like the NSA built their largest data center to date out in Utah.
Mm-hmm.
And the nickname / code name is now public for that data center was called the Bumble Hive. And they use the same imagery. That same sort of symbol of the sort of bee's nest. It's quite interesting, or just these sorts of connection points. Anyways, that was a bit of a rambling aside, but I want to throw that in there.
Everybody's focused on the Jews. It may be the Mormons, man. It's
I mean, I have nothing against anyone of any denomination.
It's just
I find it fascinating from just we think we live in a highly secularized society of just purely kind of instrumental bureaucratic systems, right? Like the CIA and the Defense Department, we're just like, okay, like federal agencies, they got budgets, they got policy, program documents, etc. But they're also like, they're human institutions, and human institutions fundamentally like there's always this tension in any society between, rationalization of human institutions, right? Like formalized procedures, bureaucratic control, everything is explicit, written down, formalized, inspectable, accountable. That's kind of the Francis Fukuyama kind of project of like institutional creation. And then there's like the, always intention of like personalization of those institutions, where it's, it's sort of the mantles of leadership are passed down, right? From like patron to supporter, or from, father to son even, right? And they become captured by other systems of power where the processes of essentially production or reproduction of who's running those institutions essentially gets kind of absorbed by a different institution, right? A much more personalized institution, or institution that maybe has a different internal mandate. And that's we in the West, because we're relatively new, state system. It was kind of maybe the sort of Roosevelt era created like the modern state, and then we won World War II with these institutions, and we sort of grew them, and they had sort of a lot of technocratic managerial ethos embedded in them in the first wave of people that took them over in the 50s and through the 70s. But then, I can imagine like there were other systems of power that grew up and had like 100, 200 years to develop inside America. Mormon Church is one of them. Like a lot of like the say banking families and sort of attached sort of law firms like Brown Brothers Harriman, right? Those sorts of guys that were essentially created the CIA. They think of themselves as like, they have loyalty to their class or even like their more narrow social or even the religious institution, and they trace that back, right? And so when these other institutions get created that have a nominal, more like impersonal structure and meant to have these processes that are meant to insulate them from any other stakeholders' interests, it's like we've seen cases where they can be captured, they can be absorbed, they can be manipulated from the inside. The Brown Brothers Harriman is a classic example where like you literally look at like all the people that were running that organization, and then going back to like the robber baron families that controlled basically most of the industries in the post-Civil War era, and it was like Prescott Bush like these, and they like wrote a memo to Truman to create the CIA, and they're like, that's our thing, and we're gonna then have a bunch of these Nazis come in to help us stand up our operations. And so there's parts of our history that we just don't like to talk about that are not as like rah America, but they're important sort of sociological things to like understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they actually have a connection to this UAP thing in a way that makes it kind of uncomfortable to talk about, because when we talk about, well, then who actually has access to this information? Who has access to these materials?
Was it you who told me, or is it like people? It's like Raytheon and Boeing that are essentially.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's probably been farmed out to multiple companies, including the big ones, right? Lockheed, Raytheon, SAIC, Aerospace Corporation, biological materials, as well to maybe other entities. But this is my point, right? Like those, when we think about farm out to those companies, what are we really saying? Like, does the CEO know? Is it part of their like internal org chart? Is there like a SVP of alien research? No, of course not, right? So I think we need to like think about it as, we don't have a name for what is the organization that is likely, the true custodian of this information, because this organization probably doesn't have a corporate org chart.
It's amorphous.
Or a bureaucratic org chart. There's like maybe pockets that align or are isomorphic to or using sort of the dual structure of those formal institutional organizational hierarchies, but there's an implicit understanding of their second hat that they wear.
Yeah, you don't codify any of the hierarchy,
and it's it's like the second hat you wear is to perform these other functions, and that's more of like a lateral set of relationships that form between different individuals in different existing institutions. And so it's much more of like a amorphous, I think, blob, right? I don't think it's like, give me the org chart of the quote legacy program. I think there probably are real legit secret programs that are formally established inside the US government to study this stuff. But I think that's actually more a matter of like, I don't know, on like the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance side, right? Like we're picking this stuff up on our different sensor networks. We would rather not those sensor networks, those detections of anomalous vehicles, to sort of make it out into the broader military intelligence enterprise. We'd rather not, any Joe Schmo with a TSSCI that has access to these different sensor platforms to be able to see the detections of these anomalous vehicles. So we would want to put in a little filter and carve that out to a special subset where only certain people can look at it. And so I think there's probably those sorts of programs that are formalized inside the military and intelligence system. But then there are these other programs we're really talking about, which is, did they delaminate from official government oversight at some point? And now we're in this position of solving kind of two key problems. And I think I talked this in other forums, is like, the folks in Congress have really two major issues to grapple with, right? Most we talk about the disclosure issue. And of course, that's like the, $64,000 question. But there's also this more mundane question of like accountability, right? Of the main allegation by Grush and other folks is that, these programs I've been sort of either illegally using, say, independent research and development authorities and funding, essentially corporate white collar fraud. They have also violated certain statutes that require, reporting to Congress. of special access programs. They've also maybe misapplied Department of Energy or Atomic Energy Act secrecy provisions to inappropriately keep these informations classified. And so there's there's a disclosure question. There's this accountability question, like how can the Congress and even the executive branch, national leadership, put in place or reestablish oversight and control and accountability over those programs. And that is almost, I think, a precondition for disclosure itself, at least in the minds of those people, right? If you're a senior senator, if you're a president, vice president, you would rather you get sort of reestablished at the top of this set of activities where you now have the briefings, you have all the information, you've got control of it before you go then to the public and you say what you want to say about that, right? The worst possible thing is for it to come out that everything we were just talking about is true. And by the way, the president and the vice president and the relevant committees in Congress are just as in the dark as you are. That would be really destabilizing and like not what someone in a position of national power ever wants to have happen. That like fundamentally makes them look sort of impotent, right? Makes them look like they're not actually in charge of what they should be in charge of. And it's like, well, what are you doing, bro? or ma'am? And I think that's the conundrum is like, as they've learned more about these programs and the nature of their activities and the sensitivity and the potential, legal problems that have to be addressed, they first want to try to solve that accountability problem. That's like what Arrow is sort of about, but then it kind of got subverted from the inside. So that's now the second move for this UAP Disclosure Act is to try to, these are like congressional gambits to try to put in place accountability, which for their perspective needs to happen before you can have disclosure. But there might be a different timeline that leads to, quote, disclosure in a less controlled fashion that happens regardless of whether they've established accountability. And that's my diagnosis of where we are, is kind of these interweaving lines. Because yeah, I mean, the UAP Disclosure Act, Senator Schumer, Senator Rounds, these folks signed, they said this in public too. Like, credible evidence and testimony indicates that relevant UAP records have been withheld from disclosure, and that legislative and executive branch accountability has otherwise been lacking as of this date. And, there's like only two elected officials in legislative and executive branches lack essentially accountability over these programs. There's only two elected officials in the government, the president and the vice president. That was the Senate stating in the bill that they believe, as a result of credible evidence and testimony, that these programs exist and they have not been properly briefed to the president and the vice president. I mean, you can park the existential stuff about NHI, whatever. That's just like a constitutional almost crisis there that they're basically saying. They're saying that like there's a bunch of this crazy stuff that's going on, and like the president and the vice president have not been told about it. I'm like, you just can't have that in a democracy. Like we're agonizing over who we're going to elect. And it's like, okay, well,
who actually runs it? Like
who's actually like, you're telling me that like, it doesn't really matter who's in the show because apparently they're not told about the most important thing that they would need to be told about. So like, that's, it's kind of, you push the UAP stuff and it becomes kind of this kind of sneery, uncomfortable topic, but it's like, guys, like we're talking about our democracy and the inherent legitimacy of our political system. There's no better like prism to look at it than look at it through this. And be like, okay, well,
doesn't seem
for no other reason, like even if you don't think that there's a there, that there actually is aliens or whatever, you should be concerned that senior senators, including the majority leader of the Senate, is saying that he thinks there's some shenanigans going on that the president and the vice president and the national leadership in Congress is not properly briefed into. Like that should be nonpartisan, uncontroversial, non-taboo, like 5-alarm fire crisis. But because it's like, you got this UAP thing attached to it, it's like, it's too sort of too much of a stigma.
Yeah.
So anyways,
we don't have to go too far down this rabbit hole, but what are the chances that disclosure comes from outside the US? Like you mentioned, the Israeli space program leader who nonchalantly admitted to stuff. Like, are people within the U.S. worried about some other country just coming out and YOLOing it?
Yes. I think that is a serious concern. In fact, you can infer that from the language from the Senate themselves in one of the bills they passed. In fact, it was even, I forget the exact piece of legislation, but it was basically the quote was, in order to mitigate the possibility of foreign technology surprise, the federal government must broaden awareness of historical exotic technology antecedents previously provided by the federal government for research and development purposes. I have that line memorized.
I was going to say, that's impressive.
I mean, it's not like I memorized the whole bill, but I've memorized that line because that line is among the most important sentences that I've read in any piece of congressional text. And people just sort of gloss over. But if you really linger on each phrase of it, it basically tells you the story here, right? At least it tells you what these people writing the legislation think is the story, which is in order to mitigate the possibility of foreign technology surprise. And it's not just the foreign disclosure of this information, meaning foreign strategic surprise, foreign, propaganda surprise, meaning China coming out, for example, and saying to the U.S. or to the world, the U.S. has been illegally keeping this a secret, husbanding this material for their own, imperial military, gain, withholding technology from the rest of the planet, and that we, in order to ensure a common shared future for humankind, we have engaged in positive diplomatic relations with the NHI that are here. And we are going to create a program of technology development and transfer to the rest of the world. And, everyone would be like, well, that's ridiculous. That's insane. Prove it. And they go, here you go. Look what we got. And they go, okay, I guess China runs the show now. I mean, and then the US would be totally flat-footed, right? So it's not even that they're saying. They're saying foreign technology surprise. So what you're saying is that China may have actually reverse engineered, or had inspired technological platforms and capabilities as a result of their own research and development programs associated with historical technology, exotic antecedents. And that is the problem. That's why we need to broaden awareness of those historical programs that those historical technology antecedents that we previously provided by the federal government for research and development purposes. So we provided these exotic technology antecedents to somebody. It leaves out that sort of prepositional clause. It's like, who do we provide it to? It's clear like private aerospace or a private consortium associated with these programs. And we need to broaden awareness of those historical activities in order to mitigate the possibility of China announcing or demonstrating technological surprise. There's so much embedded in that one sentence. It's kind of blows your mind, right? But they put it there, and I've heard similar things reinforced that emphasize all different parts of that sentence. And that is, I think, a lot of what's driving some of the national security anxiety, is that you can easily imagine a scenario where, say we did cook up some special stuff as a result of having access to these things. That would give us a strategic advantage. And I, being an American patriot, would not want to see those national advantages compromised in any way, right? That ensures our economic security, our national security, as long as they're prudently wielded in a democratic fashion, right? They're wielded in the service of a democratic, elected government, right? That's the purpose of a civilian-controlled military, et cetera, and an intelligence system that serves policymakers and not its own agenda. But that's, in theory, that's why those programs need to be kept secret, and those technological capabilities should be kept secret. But if China has made a break for these things and maybe made some breakthroughs that would be problematic for the rest of the Defense Department that maybe isn't mostly aware of these things, and especially Congress that is not mostly aware of these things. And now that this is out, we're like, well, we can't really do this sort of traditional tech arms race the way we've been doing it for the past 75 years. The secrecy silos aren't set up to do the scale arms race competition now that we have a peer competitor that is potentially, getting a jump on us. So we need to broaden awareness. We need to bring additional, groups, expertise, academics, the Palantirs, the Endurills, the SpaceX engineers, et cetera. They need to get access to some of these materials so that we can keep our competitive edge. But you can't really do that and still kind of keep this 70-year kind of secrecy in place, right? You got to assume that the genie's gonna be out of the bottle as soon as you bring in a bunch of these SpaceX guys, right? So you gotta plan for the disclosure piece, at least partial disclosure, in parallel with any broadening of the awareness to keep up the technological race. But that's also kind of a narrow military industrial complex way of thinking about it. It basically is like we need to keep making better weapons as a result of having this NHI tech, which I can see from a narrow bureaucratic lens is sort of rational in its own terms, but it's also prima facie absurd, maybe even insane, like in a clinical sense, to think that that's the most important thing, right? When you have, the opportunity here to broaden awareness on a civilizational scale for all of humanity in a fashion that's not just predicated on developing better weapons to go fight wars with China, but to like fundamentally change the predicate of the global system, which maybe doesn't need to have such an intensely competitive dynamic between, say, US and China and Russia in a competitive arms race with nuclear weapons. Maybe there's a different game we can play that's like more positive sum, that's oriented to this much different game now that we're all aware of, that has like a whole bunch of other stakeholders and actors that we weren't otherwise considering in a lot of our competitive positions and national decision making. So that's a hard thing to get like the Defense Department and the intelligence community to do, because what's the job of the intelligence community and the Defense Department? Is to plan for and win wars against other countries. That's like their job. And so you're kind of saying like, hey guys, don't do that job, do this other job. And I get it. That's like that's not their mandate, right? And so ironically, we're kind of stuck in this thing where like, we don't have a bureaucratic institution that is set up to manage this particular topic, right? So if I was going to actually like, it sounds kind of trite, but what you kind of actually need to do is set up like a department or agency like that is just focused on this, right? It's kind of like, it sounds absurd with like, oh, you just another department or agency, right? More government.
Well, no,
right?
as you're describing, I'm like, all right, private sector disclosure people just rip the Band-Aid off and tell all of us.
Well, that's what's happening now, right? There's a conference happening, the SOLE conference. That's basically this sort of thing happening since in the civil. So the private sector is doing this on their own, right? Because enough people know now, and there's enough, people have different motivations. Some are much more religious or spiritual or academic or intellectual, but some are just like financially motivated. Like, hey, like there's alpha here. I can get myself in a better position. Maybe if the government actually does open this stuff up, there could be, new consortiums of venture capital and technology, companies and academic institutions that could form, research collaboratives and win and bid contracts and get access to these materials. Like there's only so much to go around, right? It's probably not like an infinite supply of this stuff. And I don't think the government would just be like, here you go, everybody, come take a look at it. It would probably be more like it's selective expansion of research.
It's physical stuff. It's not information.
Oh, we have physical materials. We have crafts.
I know we have crafts, but like my assumption or understanding was that by reverse engineering, it's opened up information that can be leveraged by anybody. Is it like literal chemical stuff that is not native to this planet that makes this type of operation possible?
Well, yeah, now we're getting into like what we actually, I don't know, this is more speculation about what new physics or material science, the closest thing I've heard that gets me somewhere towards that is statements by Hal Puthoff, who is a senior physicist in the intelligence community, who's likely touched these programs at one point or another. I don't think he's been core to them by any means, but I think he's swimmed around them enough and has also done a lot of other sort of spooky stuff in the intelligence community. And he's mentioned the fact that in the context of a conversation he had with Eric Weinstein, that the U.S. government has classified areas of physics relating to topological physics and materials science in association with this UAP topic. And this kind of aligns with something that a national security official said to Mark Andreessen and whatever his partner, Ben Horowitz, ACCZ, when they were talking about AI regulation. And, the National Security Council was like, we have classified entire branches of fundamental physics for national security purposes. Like we can do the same for AI. when in response to, Andreessen Horst, Mark Andreessen saying you can't classify math, right? It's just basic math, basic science. And the guy's like, yeah, we can. We did it. And, and then he made that quote public. And so they're referring to, probably classified fundamental physics. Unclear in my brain whether this is truly fundamental theoretical physics, like entirely new theoretical paradigms, like beyond the standard model of particle physics, some sort of quantum gravity theory, et cetera, that's like classified. That would be a stretch, at least, but I'm open to that as a possibility. I think it's more plausible that what we're referring to is like topological physics, materials science, right? So like metamaterials, certain arrangements of sort of known material, right? Known atomic ingredients, essentially, but in a certain special configuration that gives rise to like emergent properties, right? And there's been some proposals for what that could be, right? I mean, it's all somewhat speculative, but there's been serious dimensions of research that the U.S. government is known to have been engaged in that you could imagine going on the term like anti-gravity, right? Like, there's been a serious trajectory of U.S. government research. You can kind of see parts of it kind of like spin into the open and then kind of gets sucked back in, right? So you're not sure like how much of that's. I mean, we invest in blue sky research in tons of different areas, including crazy stuff, because you never know what's going to pay off. And so I think we've definitely been investing in this research. I just don't know how much we've made breakthroughs in. And so if we bring in outside experts, I don't know to what extent it is just like technology transfer, like actual technology, like, hey, Lockheed's been able to make 2 or 3 of these like that are inspired, but they're like super finicky, they're like extremely fragile, like they're like proof of concept sorts of stuff, and they can't really make them at scale. They can't really do them. They can't really turn them into a true capability or a platform that's like reliable enough for use in operations, because the secrecy is so much. There's only so many people involved. They just can't make them. They can't make enough, or they can't do as much testing as they otherwise would. And so if you did bring in, say, more resources, more people, turn it into like a normal secret program, then you would be able to throw a lot more engineering, sort of operational, turn it into maybe more of an operational capability, right? That's true speculation. But I can imagine a scenario where like we figured some stuff out, but it's not like useful enough, right, as like a military capability. Maybe it's used for like really special surveillance things or doing other spooky stuff, but it's not like a war-winning thing that like China would be deterred by. So if you want to turn this special knowledge into something that's like war deterring, you need to like integrate it into the white or gray system of military production. And to do that, though, you have to explain how you figured out anti-gravity. How'd you figure out this crazy stuff, right? Like, maybe you can keep that like where you got it from a secret, but those might be like too mixed together, right? And so, but I think it is, getting back to the private sector, like there are individuals, I've talked to them, right? Folks that are well-resourced, serious folks, careers in Silicon Valley and venture capital and Wall Street, that have been convinced and are now, like capitalists trying to like position themselves for advantage, trying to put in place, okay, what sorts of partners do I need? What sorts of relationships do I need to have so that when or if the government does broaden awareness of these historical technology antecedents, that they're first in the door, right? There's kind of that positioning. And then we've had examples of this in the past with like Bigelow Aerospace creating that BAS company essentially that got the first contract through appropriations that were brought in by Harry Reid and crew, essentially secret money to send up OSAP, which was this, which was what, Lou Elizondo was first brought in on as a counterintelligence officer supporting James Lakatsky, who is a rocket scientist who was running that program at Defense Intelligence Agency. So that was like an example of this where a private sector operator was trying to set up this contract vehicle to basically take possession of a craft that apparently Lockheed wanted to divest themselves of because it's been sitting somewhere and they had to spend all this money to keep it a secret and they weren't really doing anything with it anymore. They were just like in storage, but really expensive storage. And they wanted to like give it away. And I know that's what was said. And the CIA blocked it apparently. But so there's examples of this, of like, people trying to sniff around and then put themselves in positions of private sector advantage. So I would expect that to just, happen, but at a much larger scale. And once you do that, it's kind of like the whole counterintelligence system that you set up is not going to work anymore, and you kind of just have to just bite the bullet now.
Start thinking laterally.
Yeah, start thinking laterally. Be like, all right, guys, like the thing we were doing for the last 80 years, it's got to change. But again, it's hard to change those people's minds. Like they've been doing a certain thing a certain way, and I don't begrudge them to a certain extent. Of like, no one wants the stuff to blow up on their watch, right? Like, I don't have to deal with this. I don't want this to be another problem I have to deal with, right? Like, can you just guys wait 2 years until I retire and then deal with it and make it that other person's problem? I think that's a lot of what's going on is like, until it's truly urgent, this is going back to the very beginning of this conversation, is like incentives and, short-term thinking and, kind of kicking the can in a lot of ways.
Well, that line that you mentioned from the bill, like if there is a chance that China is beating us at this and could leverage it, like we don't have time for a committee to get set up through the bureaucratic process over the course of years.
I mean, that's one of my main motivations for talking about this publicly. I mean, other than whatever I get to spew on some of this stuff, is like, I do think there is a deep and strategic national security implication here from our social taboo, right? Because it's not considered a part of the policy discourse in DC among people who normally style themselves strategic thinkers and who are experts in all things China competition, technology, AI, Taiwan, yada, yada, yada. I've had these conversations with these people. This is not on the radar at all. They just don't even think it's happening. They just like are ignoring it entirely. It's a complete blind spot. And I'm like, it's in those blind spots that the truck hits you, right? Right? It's usually not, you're looking out the front window and it's like, oh yeah, like I know exactly how many smart mines I need to throw into the Taiwan Strait in order to deter, or like this is the SM2, SM3, SM6 missile production rate that I need to meet to have the Indo-PACOM requirement met in 2028. Like there are people who can just spew that all the way down. And you bring in UAP stuff and they're just like, you're not a serious person. Like you're off your rocker. And I'll tell you this, President Xi and Putin, these guys know what's going on. Like these guys know what's going on. In fact, David Grush, I think, alluded to this. And one of the things that he was doing his investigation when he was on the UAP task force, he was a super senior cleared person in the NRO, NGA, and he was cleared to like among the more sensitive compartments across the government, including our human intelligence collection system. And he described reading foreign source reporting on our programs, right? So this is, our intercepts or our partners' intercepts or Five Eyes partners' intercepts of a foreign country's internal intelligence reporting to their leadership. That's a result of their collection, spying on our legacy programs, right? So you get kind of this reflection that takes place, right? And I think that's kind of what's been happening, right? And I think just there's a similar system to kind of keep those reflections from getting to the rest of the intelligence, our U.S. intelligence system, right? And David Grush, being a do-gooder millennial, was like, well, this is not good. We got to figure out what's going on here. And that is the problem, right? Because we've kept our leadership, I think, in the strategic dark on this subject for too long. We've backed ourselves into a corner. Those people have, probably violated the law. I don't want people to go to jail, just because, right? But though maybe there needs to be some sort of amnesty or,
amnesty.
Immunity.
Get the info out there. Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's kind of the issue now is like a lot of people were like, I'd be fine testifying and spilling the beans, but I need, a DOJ letter, giving me blanket immunity for any crimes or high crimes or misdemeanors or whatever that I may have accomplished in service of this, secret being protected. Some of it might be pretty nasty stuff. So, there's probably a lot of, rotten vegetables in that fridge.
Maybe like
we just have to
people
clear it out.
People murdered, or
that's what David Grush has said. That people have been injured, threatened, and murdered to protect the secret. It's been credibly alleged. There are law enforcement investigations to that I'm aware of. And he's given names of individuals he believes were victims of such a sanction to Congress. Which is, you go back to, there are, I mean, you would hate to think that that's what happened, but like,
it's not surprising. Like you would expect it.
You go back in the 60s and,
Yeah.
we were hitting people, right? Yeah. It wasn't like an abnormal thing. And like, you would hope that maybe those norms.
Our government killed JFK. Like, it's not surprising.
Well, I would say our government. I would say some people. Well, this gets a whole different rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But like, I think it's pretty clear that like
JFK was killed by.
It was the S force. Stood up to hit Castro that, turned around and whacked him. But listen to Danny Sheehan on that. He's got that.
We're gonna get down too many rabbit holes here. We need to do a follow up on this.
Well, this is the thing. Is like I know I try to this is the thing. Is like conspiracy thinking. Is like there's so many different conspiracies out there, right? And in our modern media ecosystem, right, every crazy idea can get amplified and anchored into a million different ways. And I think there are true conspiracies in history, right? Like the world is just basically the story of different conspiracies, right? That like history is just the conspiracies that were written about and documented, right? It's like most major world events don't happen because of, a popular vote. They happen because a small group of people with a lot of power and influence decided to do certain things at certain times to get more power and influence. It's just like, you really get history. This is all conspiracies. The assassination of Julius Caesar. Total conspiracy, right? Like most of like human history is just populated by these hinge events that were the result of conspiracies.
People conspiring to do things to gain power.
And so I think, it's just a mode of analysis of institutional systems of power that are mostly opaque to the average observer. And you have to be prudent and rational and not hyperbolic and not assume, the Illuminati's lurking around every corner, right? But I think people that paint everything as just conspiracy thinking, and therefore the evolution of these systems and major developments in global politics are just sort of like natural processes like the weather, right? That are just like forces that don't require any analysis or inspection. That seems like a delusional way to approach the world, right? That's like truly like irrational to think there are no conspiracies, like, because history is just defined by conspiracies. And I just have to be measured and like be fact-based and like approach history with an open eye to understanding like, how the structure of power actually works. It's not like there's some, like reptilian overlords, at least not that I'm aware of.
Maybe we'll find out. Maybe that's what discussion.
Maybe. I mean, the world's a weird place, man. I just think, people need to be open-minded, but not so open-minded that they fall victims to, everything that's on the internet.
Yeah, I've been guilty of that in the past. I like to think I'm getting better at it. Luckily,
it's like you gotta find the right measure here, right? And it's like I don't begrudge people exploring the frontier of different ideas, but it's like okay, always like holding everything lightly.
Yeah, and always come back.
Always coming back, being grounded, and just kind of like, all right, like I'm not going to ignore anything, but I'm not just going to believe everything, right? And I'm gonna try to steer somewhere in between this morass, because everyone's trying to manipulate you, man. Like everyone's got an angle, everyone's trying to hype something up, everyone's got some fear mongering, take on whatever, and that gets them clicks, that gets them eyeballs. So that's like the structural incentive for a lot of folks now. But yeah, I mean, the things that are truly matter probably aren't going to be all that visible, right, to most observers, right? The thing we started this whole conversation off with, like I was told by someone very well connected inside, European financial stuff, that like word has gone out that like capital controls are coming, but it's said not like a conspiracy, like we have this master plan. It's just like people in positions of power and influence that are close to those, they just know things before everyone else.
Yeah.
It's just the tale is all this time. And so that, and then allows them to take measures beforehand to protect themselves, protect their money, protect their friends, right? And so if you point to that and say, hey, like people are planning and introducing capital controls and financial pressure in Europe, you're like, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. It's like, well, no, you're covering for the guys that are just trying to get out of the burning theater before everyone else does. I'm trying to like let everyone else know the theater's on fire. Right? Now I don't want everyone to stampede, but I was like, you should just be aware that like, there are asymmetries in knowledge in the world, right? And this UAP story is just another example of that. There's asymmetries of knowledge. And some of it's self-imposed. Like some people just don't want to know or don't want to look at this information because it's uncomfortable or because it doesn't fit into their existing mental models. And I think, that's your prerogative. But I mean, this is the way this information is being disseminated. It is intentionally being done in an asymmetric fashion. just in the same way that capital control stuff is. It's like they're trying to get some of their friends and people in positions to get on side before everyone else. And that's like, in other contexts, people observe this as perfectly normal, right? Or normal in the sense of like, yeah, we expect hedge funds to know more about whatever deals, or there's always the rumors of like, say the Stripe acquisition of Bridge, right? Oh yeah, people in the VC community knew that was coming, right? Whispers were going around that that deal was in the works.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about Silicon Valley Bank. Peter Thiel made sure all founder funds companies got off, and then
I mean, it's just like, this is the way the world works. Yeah. Like, this is everywhere, everything. It's like you just play that out fractally in any given system. It just happens to be that systems that you happen to be know or close to, that just seems obvious that, like, of course, like I'm closer to those in groups, those hierarchies of knowledge, and therefore that's perfectly normal for me to know that before someone else does, and maybe I can arbitrage that or whatever. But when that same process plays out in maybe at a much more strategic level, much more larger, more opaque systems, that you don't have as much insight into, it's disconcerting, and so you dismiss it. I think it's just like, it's the same process, it's the same sociological phenomenon playing out. I don't know. You could call it whatever you want, but that's what's happened. I don't know. Deal with it.
Matthew Pines.
Oh man, we've been ripping.
God, I love talking to you. It always makes me feel like better than worse at the same time. Not worse, but scared. Not scared. I'm actually more comfortable about disclosure than I was. You were scaring the shit out of me, like when I'd see you in Nashville and we'd be outside the park talking.
I mean, I try to calibrate. It's like, you need to give people a little bit of a spark to wake them up, right? To get them motivated to learn more. But then it's like, you're not trying to fearmonger, and you're just trying to, like, it's like you're knocking on the door, right? And someone's sleeping and they're not going to hear you. So you got to pound on the door, and someone wakes up like, what the hell? Why are you pounding on my door? And you go up and like, hey bro, you want to have a conversation? Right? It's kind of like that kind of thing, right? You kind of need to pound on the door opens up, and then you can kind of like, okay, now and everyone finds their own way, right, to explore this topic. But you just gotta, there's no like easy answer. There's no quick resolution. It's just being comfortable with being uncomfortable, I guess. So
yeah, which if you've been in Bitcoin for long enough, you should be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So
I mean, that's why I think that your audience, this community, is probably more psychologically attuned to dealing with volatility and uncertainty and pricing dramatic change into the future. So
yeah, go spread the word, freaks. We're gonna catch up again. We got a hearing on November 13th. Who knows? Maybe we'll get more information, and I think you'll be back on the show at some point in the next 6 months, if you'll come back.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Enjoy your weekend. Peace and love, freaks.